One of the very great pleasures of the Cairo Museum is that here gold looks like gold. Not that awful weightless thing that you see in big exhibitions where they shine lights on things and they sort of float off in a sort of glittery Christmas card look. Here, this really looks like a work of art. Try and look through the gold and see the piece. It's amazing to think that it's actually constructed out of two sheets of gold riveted together. Somebody's worked it with a hammer from the back, a man tapping away. And he's done it with such accuracy that he's even reproduced the cheekbones slightly tilted, because Tutankhamun had an accident when he was a boy, and his cheekbones were 1/8 of an inch out, and so's that gold mask. People I knew who had seen this mask when it first came from the tomb said that it looked more shiny, brighter than it does now. That's because they put such a high polish on it that when the modern cleaners came to wipe it with a cloth, they scratched the ancient surface. What a marvel. An object made by people whose lives were saturated in deep colours and shining textures. Master craftsmen of breathtaking precision. And this in the age when Stonehenge was new. Of all the hundreds and thousands of people that filed past Tut's gold mask, very few of them ever bothered to come here. Yet this case in the museum contains some of its minor masterpieces. It was set up about 80 years ago by one of the early directors of the museum. And in it, he put really the finest small objects that had ever been found in Egypt. You see, most of the things that are this size were usually sort of bashed out in the workshops, and they're pretty things, but they're not wonderful. But this director, he had such an eye that he could fathom the masterpieces. In this case, just jumps with life. Look at that piece there, for example, that tiny little statue at the top. It's the only known statue of the man who built the Great Pyramid, King Cheops. And that little thing there, extraordinary strong face of a woman, Queen T, who gave birth to this heretic king who tried to turn all of Egypt upside down. There's all of her character stamped on that little bit of stone there. Now this woman, she's equally filled with life as the queen and the king. Well, she was the wife of a man who spent most of his life gathering corn for a small village in Upper Egypt. She was an interesting person. She was very quick-witted. And when her husband was away, she actually took control of all the village affairs. One of the things she did, for example, was to go around and inspect all the measures for the wheat with which the people made bread. She wrote a very cross note to her husband saying that somebody was fiddling them, and when he came back, she'd jolly well see he got punished. She also looked at all the family affairs as well. Very competent woman. In fact, in her day, she ran the village. And these other people along here, they're probably her friends in the same village. It's a village we know more about, probably, than any other village in the ancient world. They're also the actors of our drama. And this is where they lived, the village of Deir El Medina, hidden in the hills of Thebes. A village of craftsmen, of families, of men, women and children, packed in neat houses set side by side. And how remarkable it is that modern science has given us more information about these ancient people than we have about most people of the last century. This, for example, was the Bohemian part of town. Over there lived some scribes who painted coffins in their spare time. Over there lived the leader of the village choir. I don't expect his neighbours ever made much complaint about the choir practice, though, because next door lived this awful Heathcliff-like character who spent most of his time bellowing at his poor old adoptive stepfather. And in here lived a little old lady who so loved her pet monkey that she adopted a slave boy to sit and feed it grapes all day. And in this house, well, there lived the village storekeeper. It's not a very interesting job, actually, but sort of important, and the villagers considered his fat jars so important, his big jars of fat that were rendered down from the oxen that they used to roast. The two men went to court over one of these for 17 years. And here, the little village scribe, in his spare time, used to sit and write love poetry. Can you see him, licking his brush and slowly writing these words by himself? I kissed your open mouth, and it made me drunker than wine. The modern father of our village, the man who really has given all its people back to us in the modern world, was a Czech called Jaroslav Černý. He was a professor of Egyptology in Oxford. And he studied the village and its people for 50 years. Even when he was 70, he was still walking slopes like this, climbing, looking for the village's inscriptions on these rocks over here. Our ancient villagers scribbled millions of little texts, little graffiti, told you about their days of life and birth and things like this. And that is why an elderly Oxford professor was still scrambling about here, even when he'd retired. Because Professor Černý knew these people name by name. He could tell individual handwriting. He could tell when a man had written something as a young man and an old man. And these texts are so detailed in themselves. This one here, for example, is written on the 13th of September, 1275 BC. Can you see him? There he is, a tiny little faint head. You see it there? And his two arms coming up and praying. Looks like he's waving to us from 1275 BC, doesn't it? That's the Royal Scribe, Romer. What he's doing is announcing his appointment to the village as a Royal Scribe to work in a king's tomb. He was very proud of being a scribe because Romer was the son of a messenger, was not a scribe at all. And normally, scribes, of course, it would be handed down from father to son. So nobody would actually celebrate the appointment because you'd be celebrating the death of your dad. But Romer was a self-made man, and so he was pretty proud of it. And this is what Professor Černý came up here to find, this little figure. He was a man, in the words of Auden's poem, against who the Bureau of Statistics could find no fault, the perfect Egyptian, the man on the Theban omnibus. And we know all of this from the village's own records, much of which was written on the most surprising material. These bits of stone are called ostraca by archaeologists. They're the product of making tombs. What the quarrymen literally cut out the walls. And they laid around the Valley of the Kings in hundreds and hundreds of thousands. And it was these beautiful, smooth white flakes that the ancient scribes and many other people at the village too picked up and used for writing. After all, in such a hard environment, it's a pretty good and permanent surface to work on. It was something which you could later then put onto fragile papyrus to keep in the royal records. So, this is what to us holds the village life. All the hundreds and thousands of documents, the records, come principally from this source. They wrote on it, not in the flowery hieroglyphs of the monuments, in which a little seated man, like this one, might indicate the word love or to take, but in a very rapid script, which is called today hieratic. And it's that script flashing across the surface of these stones which tells us so much about those ancient people. Archaeologists found thousands of these ostraca buried in a deep pit close by the village. A precise and careful documentation of ancient life, a library of love and envy, of greed, of griefs and friendships, all held in letters, laundry lists, receipts, bills, contracts, deeds, prayers, and sometimes even exquisite drawings. And this is hardly surprising, for our villagers were some of the greatest artists of the ancient world, the men that made the king's tombs. Let's just try and feel our way through this old landscape when Thebes was the capital of the world. Because in 1000 BC, that's exactly what it was. So let's imagine for a minute that these mountains are filled with the ancient Thebans again, the people that lived here for 500 or 600 years. Absolutely honeycombing all over these mountains here. And every night, of course, they would walk in a great mass down and look over the fields again, back to the city, which they all loved. And there they would smell the sweet breezes of the river in the evening. What an extraordinary sight it must have been. Over there, a great dusty, silty mass of houses with two huge temples at each end, probably with great white walls around them. Sticking out from these white walls, flagpoles and pennants, all flashing in the sun. That, by the way, is the first thing that the returning Thebans saw as they came round the bend in the boats on the great river. Of course, the crops were very different in those days. None of these tufty sugar canes that stand 8 feet high. The fields would have been very much smaller, and you'd have been very much more aware of all these little rivulets of water that had been coaxed off the Nile. Wonderful irrigators, but sort of lazy people. They didn't go in for great water and irrigation schemes. They were little men doing little things very, very carefully. And surrounded, all around them, these huge white temple compounds, one after the other, 14 of them in a great row. Each one with its own individuality, and each one to a particular god. And everybody here knew exactly what temple belonged to what god. And each temple had its own festival throughout the year, when the gods came down the canals to each of the temples and visited one another. And here, hidden away, the little village of our workers, the special men that went down into the underworld in the Valley of the Kings. An extraordinary group of people. Now, the tomb maker's village was some 3 miles from the Valley of the Kings. This is the path that the scribe Romer used every day to get to work. And one of his favourite sites must have been this gathering of temples, the most beloved of all Theban temples. Today we call the rocky bay Deir El Medina. These temples here contain a part of the very essence of ancient Egypt, their whole attitude to the world in which they lived. And it's one that's very different from ours, so when you first come to look at Egyptian things, you can be a bit disappointed. But that's because they're interested in a different universe. They inhabited a different world to us. That's where these temples can come in for us, because here you see how the ancient Egyptians related to the landscape. If you think of a Greek temple, more often than not, like a Gothic church even, they're in a prominent place on the top of a hill or somewhere, and they dominate the whole landscape. Somebody once said that they're like diamonds through which the landscape is refracted. Man is actually imposing himself on all the hills around. But this temple, this sits absolutely in the landscape. In fact, the architects here actually cut a bit of the cliff away, and there's a balance here between the forms of the buildings and the form of the landscape. One flows into the other. That's what makes it such a magical and wonderful place. This is the exact point at which Romer turned his back on the living, the great city of Thebes, to move over the horizon, quite literally, into the realms of the dead, into the underworld. Under the natural pyramid of this mountain is the Valley of the Kings. The mountain's goddess, Merit Saga, she who loves silence, looks down to the gates of the underworld, the fathomless tombs of imperial Thebes. This, then, is the modern doorway of the greatest archaeological discovery of all time, the most famous tomb in the world, the tomb of Tutankhamun, Tut's tomb. And of course, as everybody knows, it was found by an Englishman, Howard Carter, in 1922. In his book, he says that he was digging for years and it was very difficult, and there was this last-minute gamble when his backer, Lord Carnarvon, wanted to give up because he couldn't afford it and all this stuff. Well, I think there's a little different story, really, that's somewhat nearer the truth. So if you look at his excavation records, what you discover is that he was digging very, very close to here years and years before, and in fact he may have actually come down on the doorway of the tomb and left it again. Now, why would anybody have done that? Well, I think because Carter understood Carnarvon. Carter knew that he had to keep some of his discoveries back for the moment when Carnarvon's enthusiasm flagged. Carnarvon said, no, I can't go on anymore. Carter said, one more season. He turned up here. On the 1st of November, he was digging here. 3 days later, he'd made a very narrow trench, just about down where I'm walking. And on the 4th, after 3.5 days' work, he was already back at the doorway with the greatest archaeological discovery of all time. The tomb's doorway was filled with rubble. Slowly, Carter's men dug their way down a sloping corridor. When they got here, they found a white plastered wall, stamped with the Royal Necropolis seal all over it. Carter slowly took a stone, and just underneath a wooden lintel which ran across here, he peered through into the tomb. The first thing he noticed was the candle he was holding flickered as the hot air, trapped in the tomb for 3,000 years, rushed out past him. Then his eyes slowly began to accustom to the gloom. He said he thought he saw a wall of gold. He was dumbstruck. Now, Lord Carnarvon was standing next to him, and he was a shorter man. He couldn't really see, and he was desperately trying to find out what was going on, was tugging Carter's sleeve. Carter was glued, of course, to the most famous archaeological picture of all times, because in the little room in front of him stood those 3 huge gold couches of the king. The royal chariots lay in a great heap over there, and all over the floor, all the paraphernalia of Tuts Court. Must have been the most extraordinary moment ever in archaeology. Can you imagine what Carter must have thought? He's still there, you know, the only king of all the kings that were buried in the Valley of the Kings. Tut had been buried in an amazing labyrinth of ritual. As kings' burials were nothing like our burials at all today. They didn't even serve the same purpose. This is not a memorial. This is more like a machine, a piece of machinery. If you look around the tomb, as in all the other royal tombs, you find not one memory, not one word of how great or how powerful or how little or how unfortunate or how rich or happy the king had been. Nothing about their personalities at all. Only the king meeting the gods. These tombs are important too for the next king. That over there tells that story. It shows Tut's successor engaged in the rites of burying the dead king. You see, every new king buried his father in this careful ritual order which established the dead king as a god, which made the living king as the son of God and a true king of Egypt. So these tombs aren't like Christian tombs. They're not people waiting for the last trump in here. These are a part of a political statement, a religious political statement. So there's no Christian horror about the place. There's no Gothic myth. There's no curse involved here. There's no reason anybody should curse this tomb. This tomb is a functioning thing. At the time of the funeral, it worked. It's done its job. They might not have liked them being robbed, but there was certainly never any worry of these awful myths that surround them today. Now, Tutankhamun's tomb can show you what a buried pharaoh looked like, but it can't show you a real royal tomb. They were vast and took years to make. Compared with those great monuments, Tut was buried in a hole in the ground. Real royal tombs are very different. Just as our villagers were not slaves and were not killed after they had finished the tombs, so neither were most of the king's tombs hidden away. Let me show you what they looked like. Great high decorative doorways, a single huge passage cutting straight into the mountain. The richly decorated walls, visions of the underworld, the life's work of Scribe Romer and our villagers. In a long straight line, halls and corridors lead down to the chambers of the royal burial. And unlike Tutankhamun's secret tomb, all of them easily and inevitably robbed and plundered. Now, I'm climbing into King Ozymandias' armpit. That's the same as Ramesses II, of course. For a real particular point. You see, this great statue, I'm sitting on the edge of his broken chest. Here's the top of his arm here. His head busted, lays out over there somewhere. For a particular point, and the point is this really, that these statues are not made like they are in the movies, you know, with 55 extras banging away with chisels. These are really incredible works of art. Nobody can make them today. That's not because we lack the skill or any individual lacks the skill, it's because we don't work in community anymore. Look at the way these muscles are explained here. See, here's the shoulder coming round here, and then slowly, imperceptibly, through hundreds of inches, it comes out and then rolls in again to hit that muscle there. An incredible description of an arm. It's even more incredible when you think there was probably one man working on this bit and another one working on this bit. It shows a community of craftsmanship that the Western world's completely lost. It's gone. It's not good enough to say there's no man can make this in the world today. No man ever made this. This was made by a group of people that worked together in an extraordinary harmony. Our villagers were just such a group of artists. Amazingly, they left us a detailed record of their working lives here in the village cemetery. This is the tomb chapel of one of the workmen of the village called Ippi. Now, he wasn't buried here. This was a place where people came on high days and holidays to have a meal, to share their food with the dead, and also to offer to Ippi and his wife. So it's a sort of link between this world and the next, really. And here you can see the man himself. He's lost his head, unfortunately, with his wife and their daughter, and they're worshipping, as you would expect, here, the king of the underworld with his blue skin. And behind him, the goddess of the Western Mountain, the peak that stands over the village, and you can see she's a beautiful lady with a fine dress. It's a woven pattern, this, and it's very interesting because you only find this particular design either in tombs in the village or in the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings. And as they're both painted by the same people, of course, you'd expect that. Which makes all these tombs here rather special. They have this wonderful quality about them. The best artists in the world. Here you can see what actually went on in the chapel. There is Ippi and his wife again sitting on their chairs, and their children are offering them food. They're a bit indistinct, of course, but you can see the son is offering this lovely pot, all painted up, and in it, bunches of onions. But it's what's in this detail in this tomb that's so interesting and so very unusual, too. See this little white table here? You see on it a lovely dish all bedecked with flowers, and inside the dish, little figs. And there's joints of meat, and here, a beautiful duck, a lovely curved neck. You see it's been slit open. It was stuffed with something delicious, like some nuts or something, I expect. And it would have been baked in honey. It was a real delicacy in ancient Egypt. And other joints of meat. It's all these little details that are so delightful in this tomb. Here you see Ippi is wearing these wondrous linen robes. The finest linen ever woven anywhere at any time was made here. And on Ippi's lap, the family cat. What is really fascinating about this tomb, why it's a privilege to be here, because not many people actually ever get in this tomb, is the fact that all the support industries that kept these people in such sort of magnificence, really, are all painted on the other walls of the tomb. It's as if Ippi wanted to bring them all along to keep his standard of living up. So here, we've got a little picture of the very men who washed his clothes. It's quite unique. They're the village servants, and there they are all chattering away and scrubbing and washing down by the river. See, on this wall, Ippi had really rare scenes of the village servants painted. Don't often see these sort of people in the tombs. Look, here they are, the fishermen of the village, edging through the marshes at the side of the river in their boat. And as a good middle-class artist, he's made the workers all look a bit comical, you see, with a funny round nose and rough hair, and they're all sort of chattering and gesticulating at each other. But, nevertheless, funny though they were, a nice big catch of fish for the villagers, which after all was their main source of protein. And here, after the fishing, right in the corner here, you can just make out one of the same fishermen
mending his nets, and it's done in extraordinary detail. I mean, that hand is really, we're talking about a quarter of an inch here, you know, and every fingernail, and even the knot you can see, the man tying it up.
And this chap here is one of the village craftsmen, and he's working on a mummy mask, much like the mummy mask of Tutankhamun. This wall, you see, is really filled with the villagers at their own work. Here, for instance, is one of the toolkits, a carpenter's toolkit. Have a saw here with its teeth, and its handle a little strange, but much like a modern saw. And here, the final part of the mummy, is this scribe painting away on the beard which comes on the wooden mummy case. And this little fellow, of course, is holding the mummy up to stop it moving around whilst he's painting. Now, normally, you know, artists hold their paints in Egypt in quite large bowls, but this man, he has a scribal palette. It's another indication, really, that it was the scribes themselves who were very much involved in painting things in the village. In fact, you know, this whole wall is just sort of filled with village life. It's quite extraordinary. Underneath, the artist in this scene here, where there's a dozen workmen working away on some great bier, like a great wardrobe, some ceremonial object, has really looked at his fellows with a very caustic sort of an eye. And this guy here, for example, lucky fellow, has just had a big, heavy mallet dropped on his foot. And he's calling out to the guy above to be more careful, you see, whilst this man looks round. It's a big object. You can see they're actually working on the top of it. Here a man has left his bag full of tools, just like a plumber's bag. See, with a saw and a chisel sticking out of it. And here, well, somebody's gone to sleep and somebody else is waking up, perhaps because the foreman's coming, you know. And these little fellows, of course, are the people that lived in our village houses. So as much as the past can ever give you itself in real life, this must be it. Most of our workmen's village has been excavated during this century. Rubble and windblown sand had sealed it for 3,000 years. Now, our village is empty. Its people have gone away. Their houses are ruined. But not too far away, modern villagers are still living in much the same way, still employing the ancient methods to cope with many of the basic problems of daily life. Just as our ancient villagers did, the Nubian villagers use vaults to catch the wind and cool their houses. And the Nubian villagers still use the flat roofs to sleep on in the hot summer months and to store their things. Our ancient villagers did the same. Much of North Africa still cools its water by evaporation in the age-old way that our villagers used. Of course, such comparisons get ever more dangerous in their details, but in their order and regularity, their environment and their building methods, these two villages, ancient and modern, share a great deal. But to see the actual stuff of village life, we must go north to Turin, where there is preserved a unique treasure, the tomb of Khan, the architect. The wonderful thing about this tomb is that our villager took all his house with him to his grave. This is a time capsule. It's what was in every village house. This bed here, with its linen and its blankets, this is the bed he slept in. That curve, that slight curve in the middle, is the bump that you get when you sleep in a bed too long. That's his pillow over there. It's a strange, hard wooden thing that fitted under the ear. It must have been excruciatingly uncomfortable. God knows how they survived. This is his wife's handbag, or what passed for a handbag in those days. I suppose, like lots of handbags, it's a very strange mixture of pretty little things. You see those two little duck's heads on the top of a perfume flask? How delightful. There's another perfume flask in there as well, and it's still sealed with perfume that's 3,000 years old. And here, that little pot in front is her eyebrow pencil. And at the bottom of it would have been this black stuff called kohl. The ladies in Egypt still drop into their eyes so that the black powder floats off and makes a fine black line around their eyes. Very good, very healthy for the eyes. That's the lady of the house's wig. It's made of human hair. She wore it to parties. It must have come down right over her shoulders. And this is the gentleman of the house's toilet compartment.
You see, he's still got what passed for Brill cream in those days, a special perfumed hair oil. These are his razors. And they're extraordinary things, beautifully made, bronze. You sharpened this edge, I think, but God knows how you ever managed to... I suppose sort of like that somehow. God knows how you ever managed to shave with such a thing. I haven't actually worked it out. And this beautiful little thing, the things of everyday life, the things that people carry about with them, that are closest to them, this little worn figure of a horse, a little pair of tweezers for pulling out those odd hairs. Egyptians were very fastidious people. You can see that too in their clothes. Look at these wonderful examples of ancient tailoring, practically unique. Look at the care and delight in this neck, as the tailors made this beautiful loop and then caught it in a bow, just like a fashion designer. You see that little decoration on that stick? That's the sort of decoration that people must have had in their houses, but which hardly survives today. All we've got left is the monuments. It's a very famous stick from our village, and on it says, "Support me, O stick, in your old age." This, if you like, in the next case here, really, I suppose it's the heart of ancient Egypt. It's a fuel parlour, certainly, because these are onions, real onions from the ancient fields. And that's ancient bread, just as they make it today, except this is more than 3,000 years old. And those, of course, are the standard ingredients. If you look at any Egyptian stela, the first prayer will be, "Give my spirit bread and onions to eat." That's the basic diet. That's the diet that fueled the people that made the pyramids and our villages when they were making the royal tombs. But this bread, this is special bread. This has come from the altars of the gods, from the temples. And you see, as you gave things to the gods, you wanted gods to hear your prayer. So there's little ears, so that your prayer will be heard, fashioned in the loaves of bread. So that naturally brings you on to this case. And this case is full of the man's kitchen. Isn't that extraordinary? Look, there's a kitchen pot, a nice bronze cooking pot, still full of porridge or some gooey stuff that he was cooking up in it. Doesn't look very delicious anymore, I must say. And these are all his herbs. His herbs, his dates, his raisins, his garlic, all the food laid out for his spirit in careful little bowls brought straight from his household. Of course, it would have been unlucky once he died to leave it there. That's why it's all in his tomb. But this, it's only a tiny little amount. This, if you like, is the village's wages, because this is what the people were paid in. And it's a sort of little symbolic gesture in the tomb. This is the grain. And every month those donkeys came up the track bearing the king's grain for the people that made the royal tombs. And that is some of the men's wages from our village. You may wonder why such intelligent people as the ancient Egyptians, and our villages indeed, bothered to bury dead people with all these possessions around them, and these beautiful things too. Well, I think to answer that question, you really have to start to look just a little into how the ancient Egyptians divided the person up. Because in these divisions of a person, each one of these divisions had its own heaven. Now, this is a burial chamber. It's the burial chamber of a villager called Stonehenge. And this is where his corpse lay. And that was a part of Stoneheng's personality, just one part of it, his body. And this is Osiris, the great god of the underworld, the great green-faced god. And these two eyes, these staring eyes, looking out through the strange mirror that divides this world from this mysterious region of Osiris. So this is the god's domain, and this is part of the heaven that the body inhabits. And that, of course, is why the possessions are here, because possessions really are part of the body. Your clothes, your chairs, and the food you need to eat. It's part of the destiny, part of the heaven of the body. And that's why the things here are made so well, because it is a heaven. Now, there are other heavens for different parts of the person. And one of those is the person's soul. Now, that goes up to heaven. And these are the souls of our villagers, these stars up here. Here's Stonehenge worshipping older villagers, but he too would be a star and shine in the night sky. But our villagers were very keen on the heaven that belonged to a person's personality, to his image. And this is a villager's heaven. And for a man who spent his life in the desert, chiseling away on dry rock, old Stonehenge saw his heaven as this beautiful garden with lots of canals running through it with date palms and beautiful flowering plants and perfumes. And of course, he ploughs the fields. He's not a real farmer. He's never ploughed a field in his life. This is strictly your Sunday farmer, you know, with their fine linens and things. Here they plough, and here they reap.
Two of the great wonders of ancient Thebes were the colossi of Memnon, each one carved from a single block of glistening quartzite, the hardest stone the ancient people ever quarried, and this carried from a mountain hundreds of miles away. The most remarkable thing in this place, perhaps, is that which has vanished, one of the biggest temples ever made. Behind these two statues stood two vast mountainous entrance walls where I'm standing, a single doorway as big as an aircraft hangar's, with granite hinges, the huge wooden doors of Lebanese cedar covered in bronze. So as I turn now into this spare field, you must imagine that I'm walking through a great courtyard. Now I'm coming to what used to be the heart of this temple. All that's left of this colossal wreck is this wondrous stone stela. It's a fine irony, really, because this, if you like, is a deed by which the king gives the god this great temple. These lines actually record some sort of an agreement that the two have made between themselves. Listen, I'll read you a remarkable piece of this document, where the king is actually boasting to the god about his great gift. Come, Amun-Re, lord of Thebes, see the house that I have made for you. I have made it in excellent work of fine white sandstone. I have filled it with monuments, with statues made of mountains, of alabaster and pink and black granite, of gold and every splendid, costly stone without end. The god is greatly impressed by this, according to the stela. And in the end, he takes the gift and he takes the son to his heart. Come, my son Amenhotep, I've heard what you say, I've seen your monument. I am your father and I accept what you have made for me. So with this great gift, of course, went a huge foundation. Went hundreds of thousands of workers, scribes and everything else. And Ramosa was one of these. It was where he got his education. Now, why would such a fortunate young man leave this lavish compound and go and live in a small village in the desert? Well, to understand that, we have to go to one of the oldest and most elegant monuments in the Valley of the Kings, the tomb of King Tutmosis III. The tombs of the old kings have been made in a very particular way. See, the artists and the quarrymen that have made them left the walls bare right up to the time of the funeral. All they painted was the stars on the ceiling and the border underneath. It was only after the king had been put in his coffin that the scribes came in here and quickly dashed off the wall paintings in just 2 or 3 days. You see, the painters knocking in this border here were moving so fast down the wall they couldn't even be bothered to move away a box which stood here, so this area is left blank. Of course, that box came in with the royal funeral, and that was the same time that these people were working away here, because the painting of these texts was actually a part of the funeral. They're not supposed to be art, they're actually supposed to be very careful and detailed instructions on how to do something, and that's why they're done with such precision, though so fast. It's a very funny mix, really. See, these writings were very, very special. They were probably only known to a very few people in Egypt. They were the guidebooks to the underworld. You see them at work here. It's another indicator of just how fast they're going. You see, these scribes are holding in their hand a palette and a papyrus, the papyrus that holds the text. Their brush is in the other hand. So they're dipping their brush in the paint, looking down at the text, and writing from right to left. They go, and then the brush runs out. Dip it again, look at the papyrus, off they go again. Brush runs out again, dip in the paint, look at the papyrus, start off again, but just at this point here, he's looked at the wrong place in the papyrus. You can see he's copied the same phrase, see that eye there, from there to there, as it is from here to here. He looks down again, realises what he's done, and he's off again, straight away, without even bothering to stop.
But later kings, the kings that our villagers work for, wanted more opulent monuments. And this brought about a change that affected the lives of many people, including our scribe Romer.
To make such beautiful walls in the new tombs was a long and laborious process. First of all, the artists flattened the wall out. So flat, so precise, I mean much more than any modern wall you've ever seen, really. And then the outline draftsmen came along, the guys who laid out the whole walls. And they started off with strings which they dipped in red paint. And these were laid at the precise intervals along the wall that they wanted and snapped against the wall to give dead straight lines. And then vertical ones were added too. Those fit absolutely harmoniously to the architecture. And then a man, working very slowly and very carefully, very laboriously, came round and redid it all in black. So that where the rushed version was perhaps a little wrong, this one was finally placed. And this was done very carefully because of the next process was so very laborious. And that was cutting down all the back surface of the wall. And you can see a man actually at work here. This thing is half finished. This is where the sculptor is working. You can just see him. I mean, he's literally walked out the door and I've come in, right? 3,000 years later, and he has a chisel in his hand, and he's standing here going like this. And he's slowly, slowly working around this figure. And this figure represents the flesh of the king going into the underworld. So for the sculpture, this figure has to live. And that's the terrifying thing about this work, because it goes on for yards and tens of yards and hundreds of yards through the tombs. So all these signs down there, these little hieroglyphs that are letters of the alphabet, these are actually little living people, little living men, little living birds. Can you imagine the work? So the gods and goddesses at the bottom of the wall took even more skill. And when you get onto those huge, beautiful figures of the kings and gods in the outer corridors, well, they're really the work, and the long and involved work, of master craftsmen. Obviously, making tombs like this is a lot more hard work and labour than making the much smaller and simpler old tombs. And of course, that's why they're not finished. That's why the first ones aren't finished anyway, because the gangs were still working in the old ways. So what happened was that the whole process of making a royal tomb was reorganised. Couldn't make the gangs much bigger because there simply isn't the room in these tombs to employ hundreds more people. It actually proved practical to keep the gang about the same size. What they did do was to streamline the actual work process of the gangs themselves, because that had been actually rather lackadaisical. The old foreman had ordered the chisels and seen the supplies and made the reports. Now, that was a special gang of scribes brought in to control all that work, separate from the foreman. And that is why Romer joined the villagers.
So here, in the Valley of the Kings, he spent the rest of his life controlling the work at the king's tomb and, as he grew old, training his successors. And one of these, his stepson, has left his mark all over the cliffs of the Royal Valley.
Oh, well, here's Howard Carter, 1917. And here, next to him, Ken Hare Copperchef, 1300 BC. He was a difficult man, a cunning old man, in fact, at the time he worked here. He understood how the village worked and how all the little courts could be manipulated and exactly how the power structure worked. He was sometimes very rude, too. He was very manipulative, but he was a historian. He made himself
a personal copy of the text of the Battle of Kadesh. He made lists of all the temples at Thebes. He was very interested in history and in kings, but the men didn't like him much. To them, he was bossy and arrogant. And perhaps that was just as well, for making tombs was hard work. First, you cut out the doorway from the rock. Then, foot by foot, you cut your way into the cliff. And in Kenher-Kopeshef's day, the work was especially urgent, for his king was old and ill when he took the throne and wanted his tomb in a hurry.
The workmen reached this point in the tomb after about 3 years, and then the quarrymen hit a snag, quite literally. That up there. They bashed away at that huge lump of flint with their chisels for some 20 days. At least that's what Kenher-Kopeshef's record tells us. But of course, they didn't get very far. They just managed to chip a little bit off the end. It must have completely buckled their copper chisels, and that's all they had, you see. No steel at all. So they just left it there and carried on. Kenher-Kopeshef's records are very exact. He was in charge of the baskets, which they carried all the chippings out of the tomb. He was also in charge of the chisels. And he was in charge of the lamps.
And it was by these flickering halos of light that the villagers hurried to finish the tomb.
So the poor old king's funeral procession wound down through the corridors, came into the royal burial chamber. Poor old corpse, blown as dry as an egg, its arthritic body all wrapped up in bandages, covered in resins, put in 2 beautifully finely made cedar coffins. Another alabaster coffin was enclosed under this. Now imagine a procession. This is not like a procession today with orderly people walking in ranks. This is a swarming mass of people, very intent on doing things the right way. So you've got all our villagers down here with great wooden staves to move this into the final position over the coffins. And right at the end of the funeral, after everything was done and all the priests and all the villagers had swarmed all over everything, Kenher-Kopeshef, 1 or 2 other of the priests, would have gone round and carefully lit 4 candles to keep the spirits of sand and of demons out of the corpse. And just before they left, after they did that, they put water on a bed of grain that would rise in the dark and give the magic of growth to the dead king.
The skyline of Thebes, a quiet and ancient landscape that once held within it the capital of imperial ancient Egypt. And our village, the village that made the royal tombs. A landscape in which life is still lived in the shadow of the ancient people. A landscape in which our ancient villagers went to market. This market, that has been held on the same day, in the same place for more than 4,000 years. Where the landscape and its people still hold the dignity and rhythms of ancient life.
شكرا بكره انتهينا ايوه ان شاء الله ايوه شكرا. My friend asked me if I would come here again tomorrow to drink some more of his tea, and I told him I would, inshallah, if God wills. You can't do anything here without saying that. You have to say inshallah after anything. I will walk down the road if God wills. Tomorrow I will come to see you again if God wills. Everything is by the will of God. And this isn't just if I'm lucky. It really means if God will let you come. It's very funny here. If people ask you, do you have a God? If you're like me and you say, no, I don't have a God, people cannot understand that. And then they looked back a little while and they said, but you say, if God wills, like we say, inshallah. And you say, oh yes, but with us, that's nothing, if I'm lucky. To people here, it is very, very real. God is directing every moment of every day for them.
It's like that today in Egypt, and in a sense, it always has been. Consider the temples of the Nile and why they stand. Why kings that lived in mud brick rooms attended gods in huge chambers made of fine hard stone. The temples were links between heaven and earth, the lenses that pulled the universe into focus, and they studied Egypt with their mystical interconnections. Temples built upon the rhythms, the movements of the universe, with chambers that held the chanting of numberless lives absorbed in elegant pieties. And just as the temples held all the powers of the gods, so did the very landscape of Thebes. Here, beyond the western horizon of the city, is the Valley of the Kings, where the imperial monarchs were buried with the dying sun, in tombs made and decorated by our village craftsmen. "1,500 years before Christ, they were already working here, generation after generation of villagers, quarrying, plastering, sculpting and painting these deep, mysterious caverns set in the valley rock. Tombs designed to sustain the kings of Egypt throughout all eternity. So let me try and tell you what's going on here, because this is the heart of the mystery. In a way, the center of the Egyptian universe is the place where the Egyptians reconciled death and life. The king's death, the state of Egypt, and the rebirth of the land every year with its crops, and the sun every day in the sky. And for death to be reborn, you need a womb. And the womb is the burial chamber of the king. You also need a mother. And the king sometimes is seen as the sun who is arising every morning. And so here, you see the sun dying in the evening, going into the mouth of his mother to pass through the hours of darkness, which is the underworld in these red dots, 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on through the 12 hours of the night. And at every hour there is a door, and at every door there is a demon, and you need the spell to overcome that demon. And then the king, after overcoming the 12 hours of the night, in this gigantic struggle, is born again between the thighs of his mother goddess over there, as Egypt is born every year on the Nile's flood and every day at sunrise. For the ancient Egyptians, the landscape was filled with the gods and all their powers. Sometimes the very cliffs and rocks were carved into the figures of the gods. And in the middle of this enchanted landscape, our villagers built a settlement in which they lived whilst they made the royal tombs, on the horizon between the valley of the dead kings and the living valley of the Nile. All the tomb makers slept here, and in the evening sat on stone benches and talked together. And here it is that we will find the hut of the Scribe Ken, Herr Copperchef.
That's the house of Mr. Kaha. He used to make heart scarabs in there in his spare time for mummies. That's the house of his friend over there, I think. Yes, that's right. He used to paint little wooden plaques. And this then, That's right. This is the biggest house in the village. Belonged to our scribe. Of course, there would have been a door there in those days. I've opened this way. Here's his bed. And this, yes, this is his office. See, it's the biggest, most important room in the village. The only one with a nice tiled floor. That means, then, that out there, yes, there it is, that's his seat. I wonder if he was sitting on that when he was propositioned by his hairdresser. Scribes spent a lot of time having their heads shaved, as they wore elaborate wigs. But why would anybody want to bribe Scribe Ken Kopyshev? Well, he was a pretty important man in the village. After all, he was scribe here for some 50 years. You've got to think that from this tiny little room, he sent letters out to the king, to the vizier, to all the officials of Thebes, to the villagers, to the priests, just about everybody. He knew everybody. In a sense, he was Mr. Fix-It, especially at the village where he sat on the law courts and everything. He was a pretty big man. He was an unusual man, too, because he doesn't seem to have married till he was over 70. And when he did, he married a girl of some 12 years old. Actually, I think the young girl quite liked the old man. She had no children by him. She married again, another workman, and she had 7 or 8 children by a new husband. But her first son and her eldest, she named Ken Kopyshev after the old scribe. Close by their settlement, our villagers made their own shrine, and this exactly at a point from where they could glimpse the vast temple of Karnak, deep in the shimmering heat of the green valley below. Both shrine and temple were dedicated to the same god, Ammon, the king of the gods. But there were many other powerful gods in Egypt, such as Horus, here at his temple at Edfu. Now, Horus and his story are essential for any sort of an understanding of the ancient Egyptians. And here, his great family epic covers acres of wall. In this scene, Horus is on the right. His mother, who is kneeling, is in the middle. And the man on the left is the king. Believe it or not, they're all attacking a small hippo who lies under the prow of the boat. Now, this hippo is his uncle in another disguise. He's Seth, and he represents the forces of chaos and disorder. It's a good animal, really, when you think of this great sort of blundering beast that runs through rushes and busts things up and everything. They're attacking him because Seth is trying to get the kingship of Egypt. And he's killed the real king, which is Horus's dad, and Horus is therefore fighting for his legitimate rights. So this is a battle between chaos on one hand and order on the other. Now, the interesting and subtle thing about the Egyptians is they didn't only revere Horus as a representative of legalness and order, they also revered Seth because he's the other end of the tension which represents civilization. They even saw men of Seth in their own society. One of these at our village was a man called Parneb. If ever there was a man of Seth in the village, it was the foreman, buried in this tomb. And here he is, the old reprobate, Parneb himself. Actually, it's very difficult to talk about people like this, because people tend to deliver rather over-quick moral judgments on them. And there's a man who drinks, who fornicates, who makes big rows, who makes trouble, but at the same time he's a very talented man. He's actually talented enough to run a gang of workmen and make royal tombs for some 20 years. He was much loved by his family, and by a lot of other women in the village too, for that matter. He got in and out of scrapes for a long time, but at the same time he kept the gang together for what, nigh 20 years through 5 royal tombs, and in that time they made some of the finest work in the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings. It was very fortunate at this time that Parneb's gang held some of the finest stone carvers ever that worked in the valley.
It was their fortune too that they were able to work on this beautiful, pure white living rock, because this limestone in this part of the valley is some of the best anywhere at Thebes. Now these people used their skills not to make dinky little patterns all over the walls in the manner of excellent craftsmen, but as thinking artists. Look at these beautiful broad shapes here. Normally, people with this sort of skill at their hands try to celebrate it all the time in complexity. These guys go for the reverse. They go for the large, long, meditative shape, a very simple form that nevertheless describes perfectly, say, this kilt or the curve on the leg in the simplest possible way. That, in a sense, is one of the supreme arts. It's the art of simplicity. This is an excellent example of their sense of design, for example. The king's arm comes down as a simple shape, turns into beautifully sharpened lines on the fingers, which again lead us into the water running from this pot. Sharp little black quivering lines that shatter over an offering table here that are resolved in 3 beautiful globes of fruit, very simply, and then flow down to the bottom, the tension all resolved. It's the sort of magnificence of design that you can expect only of the finest artists. And all the time, as you walk along, superb details, little throwaways of the artist's style.
You can imagine, then, that in a community of artists, such skills and talents would attract a lot of jealousy, especially when Parneb made few concessions to respectability. This lively drawing has been taken from these fragments of papyrus, the celebrated erotic papyrus of Turin, which after years of dedicated study, scholars have successfully restored in all its rich detail. Now, we don't know for certain if the balding satyr in these pictures is Parneb or not, but certainly they were painted in our village and could easily have been inspired by his activities. Here, for example, he has fallen dead drunk out of his bed. Parneb wasn't always that amiable. No one knows anymore why Parneb lost his temper one night, but lose his temper he did. And we do know that when he lost his temper, he came running down this street, went over these steps, up to this very door with a brick, and tried to bash in the lock to get to the foreman, who was standing terrified out of his wits on the other side of the door. It was an extraordinary evening in the village. It must have caused a great fuss. 9 men came and grabbed him and hauled him off, and it kept him all night. The papyrus that records the event says that 6 of them were beaten by him in the course of that. What an extraordinary man, a man who could keep a red rage up for hour after hour after hour. And this foreman was no just man to get angry with. He wasn't the boss of the gang. He was the very man who had adopted Parneb. So Parneb is showing this awful rage towards a man who is showing him affection and will continue to show him affection afterwards. Obviously, Parneb was a very difficult, emotional man. Well, how did Parneb manage to survive and flourish? The answer's here in this royal tomb. Parneb's wonderful sculptures at its entrance are followed, deeper into the tomb, by these miserable drawings. The throne was weak. Little kings came and went, and in such dismal times, men with Parneb's talents often flourish. The drawings took, 5 minutes each? Yet they are the exact equivalent of these wonderful golden statues from the earlier tomb of Tutankhamun. And it was for stealing just such a statue that Parneb was eventually stopped.
So how on earth can you say with such confidence that you know about all these people that lived, after all, 1,200 years before the birth of Christ, people like Parneb? Well, they made things. They made hundreds and hundreds of stones that now are scattered through the museums of the world. It's by piecing all the information that they hold together that we can reconstruct their story. This piece, for example, it's quite an important piece of family history, also quite a pretty thing as well. You see here, on the top, There's a little drawing of fruit and vegetables. It was set up outside the tomb. And the family will come up and leave these little offerings here for the spirits, the dead. And I guess that when they poured the wine on here that ran down this little slot and went down there, that the wine they poured was date wine, because, see, there's a pretty little palm tree here. So the person who was receiving this offering, the spirit of the dead person, must have quite liked date wine. Now here are the people sitting down. That one, this inscription tells us, is Parneb's own wife. And it's one of the very few mentions of her name that we have. This one here, again the inscription tells us, is his grandson. And he is being offered to, rather unusually actually, by this figure here, which is Parneb's son, one of Parneb's sons. So the stela actually is a rather sad little document because it's showing us that the father is making arrangements for the spirit of his son, that his son had died before him. What's even sadder, of course, for Parneb's family is that little stones like this tell us that Parneb was killed for his crimes. And one of his sons ended up working in the mines for his part in it.
Being sent off to the mine was a terrifying fate for Egyptians, and unfortunately it was quite a common one in our village. In fact, it was so common that one of the scribes actually drew a map of the place. Now it's the oldest map in the world. This is a copy of it. The original was about 10 foot long. As you can see, it's a horrible great black valley, and running through it, in a red dotty snake, is the road. At the end of the road, a red mountain, and that's what we're going to find. You know, there's only one place, really, that fits our ancient map, and that's here, the Wadi Hammamat. It's a strange place. It's a great road that runs from the Nile to the Red Sea. It's a 7,000-year-old road, at least. People have been coming down here that long. And I've just been wandering about the place, and I found all sorts of evidences, strange little things, the early travellers, I suppose. I found a piece of a stone pot. Could well be 3,000 or 4,000 years BC, that piece. I found a New Kingdom water jar from the period of our village here. And the Romans, of course, lots of Roman pottery around this well, that's where they dropped. They were the people that put little stations through here and controlled everything very carefully. And of course you had to pay to go, it was the Roman Empire. And so we have a notice which says that in the reign of Domitian, for example, it cost 5 drachms for a camel to come down here. Cost 5 drachms for traders and for sailors at the Red Sea, and 20 drachms for whores. And that's a funny thing because one of the early Christians, a very saintly man, was coming down here, and the customs officer said to him, what have you got with you? And he said, nothing but temperance, righteousness and charity. And the man wanted to charge him 60 drachms because he thought they were 3 whores. Well, I'm sitting in the exact spot in the valley which is indicated on this part of the ancient map. Look, you can see the tops of the great black hills behind me. And very interestingly, see these pink dots? The ancients noticed that in the floor of the valley there were these coloured stones, these little pink stones everywhere. They put them on their map because they're really keen geologists, and that's what they're here for, stone. So they're likely to notice things like that. But there are other clues here to what happened to Parneb's son, and they're on the very walls of the valley. No, none of these are the right texts. Look, I tell you how I can tell that. It's because of these shapes here and the signs that are in them, because these shapes, called cartouches, hold the royal name. They're called cartouches because the engineers that came with Napoleon's expedition thought that the shape was the same as the great wads of gun cotton that the armourers used to put down the barrels of the cannon to fire off the shot. But here, of course, in ancient Egypt, it's a simple little rope. And they always come in pairs, or usually come in pairs, but they always contain the name of the king. Look, I'll tell you how you can read this one. Originally, where that's a bit broken now, it was a little animal, the Set animal. And so the name reads Set, and this sign E, so you have Set E, beloved, that signs mean beloved, of the god Ptah, and that's spelt out for you. These are just phonetic signs, like an ordinary alphabet. Ptah, the god Ptah, he of the beautiful face, the god of craftsmen. Every king liked to be beloved of the gods, you see. So, there's the name of our Seti in his cartouche, with a decoration of feathers above, and a nice little gold sign, another decoration really, but very appropriate for this mining area here underneath. But still, it's not the inscription of Parneb's son. We've got to go somewhere else to find what happened to him. Beautiful, isn't he? But it's not Parneb's son, it's Min, the god of the Western Desert. Oh, this looks like something. Right up here. Oh, blimey. Oh. Yes, that's it. Here's a cartouche. It's the king I'm looking for, Ramesses IV. And there he is up there, you see, worshipping first Ammon of Thebes and behind Min of this desert. And this text is talking about the grand expedition the king organised here. It was a wonderful show. The high priest came, 50 other priests in attendance, charioteers, army squadrons, even vets for the horses. It must have been amazing. But the real grim work, the part that Parneb's son was in, was digging the stone for the royal sarcophagus. And in that work, of the 8,500 people who came here, 900 of them died. It's in this awesome place that Parneb's son probably ended his days. It's really the finish of the village feud. Can you imagine sleeping in little rough huts in the desert? Stone here is so hot from the midday sun. You can feel it coming off your hands now. It's an extraordinary place. You imagine banging away day after day till the skin on your hands goes so hard that you can't straighten your fingers out anymore. They're just like receptacles to hold the tools you work with. Parneb's son never worked in a royal tomb again. You know, one of the most remarkable things about this map is not only is it the first map in the world, it's also a treasure map, because the inscription on the end of it says, "These are the mountains in which gold is quarried." And if you're very careful and look at the landscape closely, you can actually identify where the old gold mines were. You see, we've come up here through the grey mountains of the Wadi Hammamat, where Parneb's son worked. And now we come here into the red mountains. There are many different valleys running off, and this is a very unusual feature in the desert. We've got 5 exits from this little valley, and here they are on the map. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So, if I'm right, the ancient gold mine should be quite close to this shrine, which is marked there, which means the actual shrine itself is just over there. So, I'm climbing what the map calls the Mountains of Gold. I'm going up to the shrine of Ammon, of the pure mountain. Well, this seems to be the oldest inscription in the place. And that's only ancient Greek. But I suspect this is the Shrine of Ammon because holy places have a habit of staying on one spot for a very long time here. So, if we assume that this is the Shrine of Ammon, and those mountains over there, according to our ancient map, the hills in which the gold was washed. And that road there, well, that's still the road that leads to the sea. That there, then, the ancient map tells us, is the mountains of silver and gold. And over there, behind that modern house, is the settlement of the gold workers. These gold mines in this area were the third biggest in ancient Egypt. Nubia was the greatest. Gold poured in from there, mainly to plate the temples, some to go in the tombs of the pharaohs, some for jewellery of the court indeed. But for the men who worked here, it was a terrifying experience. The work was long and hard, and I suspect thousands upon thousands of men died. As the ancient people were quarrying this terrible hard granite for their gold, you'd expect them to be pretty economic in their mining, and they were. What they did, you see, was to follow these tiny little veins in the granite which held the gold, tiny but very rich grains of gold, and that they followed deep into the rock until it gave out. And in fact, they were so efficient at quarrying these grains that when a few late Victorian eccentrics came back here to reopen the works, they went bust. There was nothing left for them. But in their time, of course, in the ancients' time, they provided tons and tons of the precious metal. Have you ever thought about that metal, how strange it is? When you think of all the gold that there has been in the world, and how most of it, over the centuries, is recycled generation by generation for its jewellery and its precious metals. And when you think that ancient Egypt used gold for plating huge temple walls, they had ton upon ton of it, gold like the sand of the desert, says the Bible, was in Egypt. It's highly likely that people now who wear modern rings have just a few flecks of Pharaoh's gold with them. Pharaoh's gold was not, of course, money. There wasn't any in ancient Egypt. Gold was quarried to decorate kings and courtiers and plate temples, especially the Theban temples, the awesome houses of the gods on earth. And the gold that Pa-Neb's son helped to quarry came here, to the temple of Medinet Habu, built in the 12th century before Christ, in the reign of Ramesses III, the last of the great temples of the Theban Empire, and the best preserved. By the side of these great stone temples were the mud brick palaces of the kings. So, through the king's private doorway into the corridor of his harem. Behind every one of these doors, a royal lady. Let me show you something quite interesting you don't usually see. One of the ladies' bathrooms. And look how practical it is. You see, the king's palaces were all made of mud brick, and it's a great material here in Egypt. But it's very bad with water. And can you imagine, as the two ladies stood here and poured the water over the king, how it would have splashed down him, run off, hit the walls, and brought the palace down in half an hour. So, the masons have faced his bathroom with wonderful stone. And over the top, they put a very hard, fine white plaster, even to stop the water seeping through to the mud brick beyond and bringing the bit down behind. It's a great bathroom, and it's far better than anything our villagers ever had. So, this is the heart of the Egyptian state and the centre of the empire. It's the place where the expedition to the gold mines was worked out and provisioned, and it was here that the gold was brought after it had been quarried. It's the economic capital of Egypt. It's a very difficult concept to explain because the state works completely differently from any modern one. Imagine Gothic Europe, say, with a king and nobles, and the peasants who are working for the nobles and the nobles who are, in the end, supporting the king. Well, it's the same here, except the nobles are the gods. So the king, who owned all of Egypt and everybody in it, parcelled up the land to various gods. And the gods' priests then built their temples, and the priests took all of the produce of the land, offered it to the gods on the altars of the temples, and when the gods had had their fill of it, they gave it back to the priests, who used it for their own food, and also supported the royal court on the side. It's an extraordinary idea. It also makes churches here, or the temples as they are, it makes them, if you like, the Westminster, the White Halls, the White House, the palaces, the offices of government, all wrapped into one. So round this temple, which after all is a holy place, we have the granaries of Egypt, the stables, the warehouses, the sculpture studios, and the priest houses. And the heart of all this, the temple of the god. And here, in the holiest, most sacred part of the temple, you'll find something you never see in a Christian church. A butchery and a great bull thudding along in the Egyptian sunlight. Look at him, he's been kept in a stall all his life, especially fattened up for this moment when he's brought to the temple for slaughtering. They put garlands on him, ostrich feathers amongst his horns, and his hooves, you see, are curled right round because he's never walked before. He's really only existed for this moment when he's brought into the butchery and slaughtered. And in a sense, he represents the essence of the contract between man and the gods, because on the other side of this rule is a god's shrine. And so here you have it. Gods give men the food, men offer it back to the gods, and at the end of the day, on the altars, the priests take back the food and eat it themselves. The accounts of this vast sacred combine of some 70,000 people cover this entire wall. And this part of the temple calendar in front of me here is the rations for the temple given to the god each day. That is collected from the temple warehouses that have been brought in from the countryside, put on the altars of the god and distributed back to the temple employees like the priests, the accountants, and even our villagers. It's an incredible list. I'll show you how it works. It includes everything, of course. It includes vegetables and onions and herbs and bread, 8,000 loaves of bread. Look, here are the numbers, you can see them. See these little curls? They're hundreds. And these loops are tens. And those strokes, ones. So we've got 365 daily. One that will be, of course, and then the product here. And all this column here, as I say, is all green herbs, lettuces, cilantro. This column here, it's so small, it must be some very pungent herb that you don't need much of. So this is really the list of wages, if you like, in an economy without money. And of course, our villagers would have got a lot of their food from here. Our village tomb makers were civil servants, supported entirely by the state. This lady has baked loaves which would have been a day's ration for an ancient village household of, say, 8 to 14 people. And this was not all the food that the state provided. Salam. Shukran, how is it? So, our bread was the last delivery, really, which makes up this display, which is really a family's daily ration at the village, give or take a little, because our records are a bit wobbly, and also the Egyptian scribes are, because when they talk about bunches of things, they never actually tell you how much is in a bunch. What we do know, however, is that the basic ration is bread, the old ancient bread, and beer. I don't expect they got it in litre empties, like this. The beer they made was made of barley, this stuff. There was just under 4 kilos of barley delivered to the village a day, which makes about 10 litres worth of beer. Do you know there are over 70 sorts of beer in ancient Egypt? It looked much like porridge to start off with. I think pretty revolting to our taste. But then they added things to it. If you wanted to make yourself especially high that day, you could add dates with a lot of sugar in, or pomegranates to give it another taste. Well, I suppose they ate those freely too. If you really wanted a good heavy beer, you could mix it with pure flowing honey. Honey was the only substance that the village could actually produce themselves. They had hives up in the area by the tombs in little cylinders. And the bees, I suppose, would buzz down to other people's fields in the cultivation and come back to make their honey there. Vegetables, of course. I always think that Egypt's always had the best vegetables in the world, and these are some of their oldest. Onions, well, the basic reference for all of ancient Egyptian history is everybody's spirit begs to be given bread and beer and onions for an offering. Part of our standard villagers' diet, of course. The fish, well, we've given them rather a generous supply here, I think. On average, they seem to have got about half a kilo of fish a day per household, not much. So you might say then that as regards high protein food, this daily diet is a bit short. Of course, it would be supplemented by the cheese down there, that sort of goat's cheese. Now, this is not a bad daily diet, but then you think that our villagers also got meat, perhaps on average, every 3rd or 4th day in the year, the great feast days of the calendar, when herds of animals were driven up to the village for slaughter. These feasts were really the heart of ancient Egypt, the punctuations of the year. They were also the core of the religion. Because if most religions, I think you can safely say, set out to comfort people, to make them feel in a good place in the universe, at one with everything, the ancient Egyptians went about that, not by prayer and thoughtfulness, but by doing things, like building pyramids, an actual concrete link between heaven and earth, if you like, and by processions. Processions, after all, that are the same as the movements of the sun through the sky, through the gods through the heavens, following the moon going through the starry night. And these same processions took place here on the ground in Egypt. So just as the moon went through the night, so the gods of Thebes were taken from temple to temple. And those were the great celebrations of the Egyptian year. Everybody came to them, the villagers, all the people of Thebes. It must have been incredible, like an imperial coronation with regiments of soldiers from all over the Egyptian empire, dancing girls, everybody laughing and dancing. You see, the Egyptians, rather like their gods, weren't sober and they weren't prudish. For instance, they brewed a special beer at the time of the festivals and special bread. So by the time the priests who were carrying the god on a great sort of shrine, which they mounted on their shoulders, by the time they came out, they were probably in a pretty jolly state. So you can just see all of Thebes here, stamping and dancing and shouting in this marvellous exotic display, all ostrich feathers, gold, linen. Quite an incredible performance. So these are the temple butcheries with the priestly butchers carving away to get the offerings ready for the festival of opium, which of course they get to consume later on. You can see them, this one's laying on its side, so high, you see, it comes right up to there. These are his back legs here, tied together. And here's his tail at the back. This man's attacking his head, of course. Underneath, the meat's been prepared. It's all ready on an offering table. And there's a priest fanning away gently to keep the flies off of the meat. Here you can see it's a bit of a further along in the preparation of these offering tables. Got fruit here, cuts of meat, and the priest is pouring wine into a bowl, which is later poured over this great mass of offerings. And here are two priests working away on the final details. Again, the same sorts of offerings with the special bread baked for the festival there. And these people here are putting little bowls of fire in amongst the offerings, the famous charred offerings of the Bible. All these offerings were given up to the gods to the accompaniment of music, which rose through the temples rather like incense in a Christian church, a sort of medium between man and the gods. Here you see the temple priestesses. They're shaking these magical rattles, have the face of the goddess Hathor on them, the goddess of love, and they had little bars of metal across them, and when they shook them, it made this magical tinkling noise in the temple. As well as music, of course, there's also dancing. Here are the dancing girls giving their all for the gods, and look how wonderfully the sculptor has drawn the hair in a beautiful natural curve. Here, we're coming up to the sanctuary of the temple, and you can see the final and completed offering tables. These are sort of side offerings here. These are great bundles tied up, papyrus stems tied up with the flowers hanging down and pomegranates and grapes. And you see the birds, their tongues hanging out, they've been throttled and their wings disjointed, stop them moving. And these sort of hung on hooks around the sides of the offering tables, along with these beautiful bundles of papyrus, flowers and green leaves. Egyptians loved plants. This band originally, which is hanging from the main offering table here, would have had flowers and great necklaces all the way along it. The Egyptians used to wear those too. Here you see the main detail of a really beautiful offering table with dates, pomegranates, grapes, figs, and at the top again, bundles of papyrus. And all this exotic mess of food was heaped up and prepared for Ammon in the darkness of his shrine.
But not all times were good times. Soon, the higher walls of Medinet Harbour would shelter our villagers from bands of desert tribesmen. In his youth, King Ramesses III had fought hard campaigns and taken thousands of foreign prisoners. After his battles, the hands of his Semitic foes and the uncircumcised penises of barbarian tribesmen would be cut from the dead, and royal scribes would compile lists of their numbers to be presented to the great gods of Thebes. But Ramesses III had left Thebes to live in the Delta, where he and his successors spent most of their time hunting the wild marsh bulls and building cool, glistening palaces. And the kings took the army with them. Old Thebes, rich in gold, years, age and indiscretions, would be left defenceless. It was also being threatened by natural forces. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the Nile was being strangled as the lakes of Central Africa dried out. And for Egypt, the Nile is its life's blood. Without it, there is no life. Nothing. But this happened slowly, so slowly in fact, that in the beginning, even the peasant that worked the land failed to notice. Gradually, more and more land had to be watered artificially. The river had to be carefully parcelled out to cover the earth. Year by year, the Nile gave life to less and less. Much of Egypt's land was slowly dying. The first effects of this were felt in the vast vaulted grain stores at Thebes, where stocks began to diminish. And for our villagers working in this tomb, the tomb of Ramesses III, there were lean times, for with the government in the Delta, a weak bureaucracy now ruled at Thebes.
Month after month, as the men worked in this tomb, they saw their standards of living going down. The supplies were late in coming, nobody seemed to care, they complained, nobody did anything about it. Then one day, as they came in the morning, their indignation just boiled over and they walked right off the job.
So, all swearing great oaths, as the papyrus says, the men climbed up out of the Valley of the Kings, went along this path down towards the Nile Valley, and over there to the Ramesseum, where they thought their food was being stored that they should have had, and where they wanted to stage a great protest. As the workmen came down here on their protest, you can't really say they were dizzy with hunger or anything, though they were angry enough to claim they were. What in fact was going on was that they were a body of professional craftsmen, and they felt they were being badly treated. They felt the priests were withholding the rations from the temples. They felt that authority had sort of forgotten about them, that there was nobody to complain to, and generally they were being neglected. It was really very much like a modern industrial dispute, in fact. What they were doing was going to the Ramesseum to sort everybody out. The men had walked off the job before. They'd never walked down into a temple, and they'd certainly never come right into the heart of the temple, which is what they were doing this time, right into the middle of the Ramesseum. And there they intended to stay the night. It was going to be the first sit-in in history. It's nice to think of our men coming into this courtyard, angry perhaps a bit at first, and then as the evening comes on them, sitting down in a little group in the corner, about 50 or 60 of them, all murmuring away and passing round the onions and the bread. And in fact, they won in the end. They had a few more strikes, and slowly the situation got sorted out and their rations went up again. Never as much as before, but enough to keep them going. But actually, there's something rather more significant than just winning a strike. They also lost a bigger battle because the community split. Because before in the valley, the scribes and the chief of police and all the important men of the village had always been absolutely at one with the community. But during the strike, they hadn't supported the men. This was something the men did by themselves. And so, in a way, you can say that it was the first time that there was a class division that opened in the village. It never went away.
The amber cliffs of Thebes, the desert that fringed the capital of ancient Egypt. A pitiless place where the men who made the king's tombs were born, worked all their lives, and died. Our villagers were here over 3,000 years ago, and they're still here in this preserving desert, where little changes, a landscape filled with fragments of ancient life.
The ancient Egyptians used these cliffs like a scribbling pad. They wrote all over them. They recorded everything on them, from coronations to people's deaths and births, all sorts of things. Here, it's a very faint inscription. Now it's gone down gold with age, like the whole cliff. Written with the very practiced hand of a master scribe, a man called Amennacht, who worked on the royal tomb. And it tells us that he brought 3 of his sons out here with him. Youngest sons they were, because he had older ones that were by now already grown up. Amennacht himself would have been 45, 50-ish, a senior man at the village, indulgently taking the youngest of his large family on a big treat. What did they come here for? They came to the desert for a most extraordinary thing. They came here to see a waterfall. This is another waterfall, and this one's right at the head of the Valley of the Kings, right above the royal tombs. It's funny, you don't think it raining much here in the desert, do you? In fact, it doesn't much. You only get a few spots a year here. But when it does rain in the desert, sometimes you get these terrifying electrical storms. And then, a flood occurs because the rain comes down in buckets, hits the driest sand and runs across the surface. And of course it could come down off the Sahara anywhere down into the Nile Valley. Sometimes, of course, it can even come down into the Valley of the Kings. And you get this incredible mass of stones and sand just roaring through here. Happens in a minute, by the way. 1 minute is sun shining here. Next minute, the sky's dark, pink lightning, and boulders are smashing through the valley. Something the tomb workers were very, very aware of. And one terrifying night, it was just as well they kept watch, because it seems that none of them were hurt when the water came right down here, smashing through here, gouging these cliffs, tearing the bottom off that cliff, probably knocking over part of the rock there, and filling it right up till you get to this level here. You see, down there, some 40 foot lower, that was the old floor of the valley. The new floor of the valley, where the trembling, surprised workmen must have come and stood, was just here. And this is where they left their names and scratched little pictures of the gods, the great gods who caused these terrible events. They built their new settlement high above the Royal Valley on a little ridge, well out the way of any floods. It was much more lavish than anything they'd ever had before. And it had some most extraordinary features in it. This village has no kitchens in it. No cellars, no larders. No charcoal from cooking has ever been found here. In fact, it's only little places for sitting and sleeping. All the cooking was sent up from the village by the wives down below. And do you know, we've still got some of the orders the men sent at home. Things that say, please send some more beans for my 2 brothers that have just turned up. And I suppose the women would trot up the path with bowls of steaming food for the men that lived up here. It's very odd, you know, the relationship between men and women in our village. Women came in several titles. There was, for example, a mistress of the household who was pretty posh and ran a lot of servants. Then there were other wives, more sort of common law wives, I suppose you might call them, who went out to work. They are called citizenesses by Egyptologists. They got good divorce settlements. Often their marriages broke up after 5 or 6 years, but they would argue it out and write down a written agreement between the parties, and people parted friends, and often men and women both circulated around different households in the village. But you know, the real crux of the relationship between men and women in this village is really the emotional one. And in that, they seem to show an advance on most other communities, really up until the last 100 years or so. And the clue to all this is the love poetry. Because in the love poetry you can see an equality of emotion between men and women. Both sexes fall in love. Both sexes have strong sexual emotions which are considered right and proper and beautiful, and they're expressed in the language of the religion, in fact. A lover will compare the beloved in the same way that a man will address his God. He will say, you have hair of lapis lazuli, your perfume goes through me. And she will reply in exactly the same strong language. I think the love poetry, indeed, is some of the most beautiful things that our village has given the world, because that's where most of it was written.
The wild goose soars and swoops. It alights on the net. Many birds swarm about. I have work to do. I am held fast by my love. Alone, my heart meets your heart. Beloved of men who rules my heart. O happiness of this hour, let the hour go on forever. Since I have lain with you, you raised up my heart. Be it sad or gay, do not leave me. My lover is on yonder side. The river is between our bodies. The waters are mighty at flood time. A crocodile waits in the shallows. I enter the water and brave the waves. The crocodile seems like a mouse to me. I found my lover on his bed. My heart was overjoyed. Each said, I shall not leave you. My hand is in your hand. You and I shall wander in all the places fair.
None of Scribe Amonnak's daughters would have worked upon the royal tombs. But within the tradition of hearth and home, village women enjoyed a high status, as is shown in several ancient medical papyri.
Egyptian doctors were really interested in women's disorders. They had more remedies, for example, for, say, curing the pain of childbirth or menstrual disorders than they did for digging arrowheads out of people or curing knife wounds. In fact, I think that is, if you just look at that alone, it's a very interesting reflection of the care and status of women in Egyptian society.
And nowhere is this more true than in the ceremonial that surrounded the act of childbirth.
And for that, the maternity bed was moved into the front room, the public room of the house where people normally came to gather in the evenings to sit and talk. It was just taken over for the whole rite that surrounded childbirth. First of all, the walls were painted out, not a bad idea, and on them were painted figures of the gods that you associate with childbirth. That's Tauweris with the great round stomach, she's a hippopotamus god, and a little black dwarf called Bess who runs around banging a tambourine and for some reason was a great favourite of pregnant women. And then the ancestor shrine, which is in every one of these front rooms, was also adapted. You see, normally, this being the shrine, there were little figures of the gods standing along the back wall. And these were pushed back, and 2 columns of bricks were erected there. Now, the ancient name, really, for childbirth is on the bricks. That's the name for the event of childbirth. And that's where the woman sat, squatting, actually, in the most modern position. It's come right back into fashion, I suppose, in the last few years. And that is where the village lady gave birth to their children, right in the public area of the village. But in fact, they did have some privacy because this was decorated for the event. They put 2 wooden columns up and garlanded it all with lotuses and green plants and flowers, which people in the desert love so much, of course. What a sensible arrangement it was. Not only were they using the most modern techniques that we use today, but they were also taking the woman out of the normal environment of the house, away from whatever dirt was around, and putting her in a different and enclosed place. And there she sat for 30 days after childbirth.
يستطاع الجسم يجي يسير ولا يكون بحال عسير بأهز الله ولا يغلب غالب على الله غالب.
Many of these practical household rituals have continued at Thebes to this day. Our ancient village held a family whose job was exactly the same as this man's. The mysterious profession of catching snakes and scorpions, with a mixture of skill and magic. And in the time of the ancient village, this man would have also been a doctor, treating everything from snake bites to ulcers.
If you look at the medical remedies, of course, they're the modern doctors really put their noses up because they don't actually believe that if you mix up tortoise brains and peppermint oil and rub it on your right shoulder, it's going to help an ulcer. But in fact, it might just, and I tell you how. Because it shows a system of caring in the village. It shows a way of looking and sympathising with people. If, for instance, you look at a papyrus on eyes, you'll find it, on eye diseases, you'll find it has something like 20 or 30 different diagnoses. Very, very careful. Anybody looking that careful in the eye and cleaning it carefully and worrying about the patient seems to me is part way to a cure.
Ultimately, our village was controlled from the other side of the river. Scribe Ammonnak had to walk down from the desert and cross these fields to the river and catch a ferry to see his boss. And at the landing, then as now, was a market. And still today, many of its goods will be well known to the ancient scribe. But today, some things are long gone, such as the slaves and the brightly painted coffins that the villagers made especially for this market, which would be swapped for food and clothes and other luxuries that the state did not supply. On the river, these fishermen could well be those of Ammonnak's village, netting the tomb maker's evening meal. Hard-working men who had known the scribe well and who would serve his village faithfully for generation after generation.
As the head man of the village now, almost as the patriarch of the village. Scribe Ken would have been the one who came across this river many times a week on business for the community. That is, collecting the food, sending back tools, picking up the pigments for the paint for use in the royal tomb. This 3,000 years ago was an amazing sight because there weren't just these tourist boats there. There were the grain barks of Ammon. The god owned 40 or 50 of them, and they went up and down the river, bringing in the grain from the fields to the great temples. There are also more exotic vessels that have come across the Great Green, which is what the ancient Egyptians called the Mediterranean. There have been opium boats from the Mycenaean ports, cedar wood coming in from the Lebanon, juniper berries from Byblos, all sorts of rare and exotic things.
And at the heart of the great city, the vast temple of Karnak.
Der Aufbau des Säulensaales begann in der Zeit von Sethus dem ersten Vater von Ramses II.
Today, millions are drawn from all over the world to see what the ancient people made. But they come to a strange and puzzling place. The buildings speak in strange tongues, in an architectural language that few can understand. I wonder how many tourists go away overawed by the stones, yet puzzled by the central mystery in the place. What does it all mean? Where do these doors and colonnades and pillars and pylons and shrines and dark rooms lead? Filled with people, the place still seems empty, veiled.
One more thing. When Joseph, son of Jacob, explained the dream for the
This is the building's heart, a small empty room, but it provides no clue. But there is an intelligence at work here.
Now, the important thing to remember about Karnak Temple is that it isn't a church. There's no altar, no congregation. It's the secret house of a god. Basically, this is its geometry. It's a great long path that goes from the front door to the innermost recesses of the temple. And from that, the first architects, when they planned the temple out, drew two guidelines, same distance apart on each side of the main axis. And every building that went on that axis of that temple, every time they built a bit more, bigger and bigger and bigger, was guided by those lines that they'd already put down right at the foundation of the temple. And the distance apart of these lines was controlled by a series that we modernly call the Fibonacci series. It's not really so difficult, it just means that every number in it is the sum of the two previous numbers. So it goes 1, 2, 3, 3 and 2, 5, 5 and 3, 6, 7, 8, etc., etc. So that these measurements, which go in cubits, which is the ancient Egyptian measurements, about half a metre or something, goes 1 cubit, 2 cubits, 3, 5 and 8, and so on. Now that's a wonderful scheme, and it means you can go on building the building in harmony forever and ever. However, it does mean that in the last stages of the building, you're getting very, very big sizes indeed. So this is why the first pylon is absolutely vast. So it follows then that behind the great first pylon is the biggest and newest courtyard in the Temple of Karnak. Behind that, on the main axis, through the gateway over there, is the hypostyle hall. So here we are, the most extraordinary, one of the bravest ancient monuments in the world, and the biggest hall of pillars ever made, 134 of them. And it's brave in a way because these pillars are not set in straight lines like those in Greek temples, but they're made like a clump of trees. And in fact, that's what it's meant to be. It's meant to be a huge papyrus swamp. And these great piles of stone are meant to represent papyrus stems swaying gently in the wind. The Egyptians used their wonderful hall for many different things. The king's viziers and the high priests used to hold trials and commissions in here. And Amenacht, the village scribe, used to bring the copper chisels here for resharpening in the temple workshops. The most important single function of this hall was as a processional way for the gods.
I'm moving now through the darkest, most mysterious part of the temple. The walls are coming in, the ceiling is coming up, the floor is coming down. We're coming to the apex of the triangle with the house of the god. And all around our god, in other little shrines, stand the small and mysterious shrines of the gods of Egypt.
Unfortunately, when you get to the middle of Karnak, to the heart of the great temple, the god's gone, and the house where he stood, well, it's ruined. You can't really tell what went on. But once upon a time, only the king of Egypt and his closest delegates came in here, and they attended on the figure of Ammon, stood here on this stone. It's really difficult to see it today, but there are other temples in Egypt where you can get some idea of what a god's house looked like.
And nowhere better than here, the best preserved temple in all Egypt, the Temple of Horus at Edfu.
So that then, standing over there in the gloom, is the very house of the god, magnificently cut from one piece of granite, burnished like silver, standing in a sandstone room. And in that one over there, behind two wooden doors, once stood the god Horus. These houses, you see, were like the first hut ever made on the first mound that ever appeared in the waters of chaos at the beginning of creation. And in this hut stood Horus the god in a papyrus swamp, and you can still see the papyrus swamp inside. For Horus it was who stood in a swamp, and the swamp was at the dawn of creation. Horus was the first bird standing on the first piece of land, here in the heart of this temple.
Every Egyptian temple had a lake of creation, and on every Egyptian temple's lake each morning there were certain acts that simulated the creation of the world. And one of these was to do with our friend here, who laid the egg which held, yes it did, didn't it? Had the egg which held two things. It held the atmosphere, which separated the earth from the sky, and it held a goose, which quacked and made the first sound. Go and quack and make the first sound. So we're going to simulate one of these marvellous events. It hasn't been done for 3,000 years, and we're going to launch him onto the lake of creation, just as they did in Karnak, the priests did in Karnak 3,000 years ago. Come on, mate. Here we are. In we go. Whoop. Go on. Go on. Cackle. Go on. That's it. Go on. Down the hole. Go on. Go on. Nowadays, some of our villagers' most intimate possessions are encased in the great museums of the world.
This little room in Turin probably has more recorded Egyptian history in it than any other room in the world. These, you see, are unrolled rolls of papyrus on which the scribes have written. Here, court records of a royal trial. This, the oldest map in the world. But this papyrus is the one we've come to see. It's a bit of a tatty relic, but the world in it is magic. Look at this little head. It's
little animal playing a double flute. It's the Pied Piper of Hamelin. Underneath is a bird climbing a ladder. That's a balmy thing for a bird to do. This bird can't fly. All the animals in this papyrus are actually doing strange and insane things. This is a modern copy because, as you can see, the original's a bit tatty, but you can actually work out what's going on here. And what you see is this absolutely insane world. A donkey, a bad animal being a priest, all sorts of weird, wonderful things in it.
Now, this may look like a comedy, but it's no joke, this basically unstable, topsy-turvy world. And there is another sort of drawing upon this strange papyrus.
They show 12 couples of the villagers making love. It's an erotic papyrus. It's the only one that survived. Extraordinary document. Just think about it. What it shows you, in this one long, thin strip, you can divide it down the middle. One half is stressless, tenderful, loving. Centerfold, if you like, no time in it at all. The other side, all these mad, crazy animals doing weird things. It's a villager's subconscious, you can say. You're actually looking right into somebody's mind. I can tell you more about that inside of their mind, too. I can tell you that about 5% of the villagers' dreams were concerned with making love. How do I know such a thing? Well, we actually have a book of dreams from the village. It gives you a list of 400 or 500 dreams and gives you interpretations. So you can say, for example, that if you dream you're eating crocodile flesh, you're going to become a tax inspector. If you dream you making love to your wife in public, bad, anxiety dream, that is. So, there's a lot of anxiety in the dreams, by the way. Can you imagine 15% of them are about loss of face, fear that your words wouldn't be understood in a village. So, you've got to think of our villager laying in bed. Bang, he has this awful dream. He wakes up. He's, oh my God, there's a terrible interpretation in the papyrus. What can I do? Well, the papyrus actually tells you what you can do. What you do is, you get up, you go down to the cellar, and you eat a lot of bread and drink a lot of beer, and you have a prayer. Oh God, Isis, don't let it happen to me.
And right through the villagers' most secret thoughts, and during their most private acts, there was a single God who looked deep into their hearts.
The village oracle was an especially sacred statue of the king Amenhotep I, the man who had founded the village and probably who laid in the first tomb the villagers ever made. His shrine was the most revered, set high amongst the other temples of the village. And it was from there that the statue was sometimes carried by the villagers on little processions, like the great statue of Amun-Ra at Karnak. They took him, for instance, to the Valley of the Kings. There he would be carried over the mountains with all the workmen laughing and singing in front of the statue. When they got to the valley, they'd put the god down and have a good drink and eat the special cakes they'd made. Good time was had by all, and they brought the god back at night. It was like a little outing for him. But probably the most important function of the god was as a sort of a safety valve for the village problems, because people used to ask the god questions. Sometimes, for example, he'd be taken down the village high street, and there people would come out of their houses and ask the god, who has taken my mat? Or, will my boy get promotion? Or, how long will my father live? And the god would answer them. And it was on one of these occasions that a sculptor came out of the house and asked the god to find his stolen clothes.
So the village magician was sent for. He walked along in front of the procession, and as they passed each house, he shouted out the name of its owner. The house of Kaha, the house of Senejum, the house of Nefer. And then slowly, as the procession moved down this part of the high street, it ground to a halt here, right in front of Scribe Amanakh's house. Must have been a terrifying moment for him. After all, there was this god accusingly standing outside his front door, and he rushed out and he addressed the god directly. He said, "These clothes of which you speak, did my daughter really take them?" And the god said that she had. So you can imagine the rather crestfallen scribe went back inside, saw his daughter, and together sorted out the clothes and gave them back to the man who'd accused them. Now, we don't actually know whether these clothes were in some sort of a dispute or whether his daughter was a thief. That's as far as the story goes. But how, you may ask, did the god actually manage to say yes or no to anything? How did the stone statue move? Well, what really happened was that as the bearers moved with the god, his power came into their shoulders. So as they marched down the high street, in this particular part, the statue pressed down on them so hard that they couldn't move. And when Amenhotep asked his question, the answer was indicated by the god nodding backwards and forwards.
That's how the god delivered his verdict. Such strange things still happen at Luxor, which is a part of ancient Thebes, built on it indeed. Take that mosque over there, Mosque of Abul Hajjaj. That's built in amongst the columns of the Luxor temple. As many Egyptologists would like to know what it says on the texts that are buried in the walls of the mosque. So they must have been pretty delighted when in about 1935, King Farouk donated the mosque on which I'm standing to hold the remains of the great saint who was buried in the mosque. And a strange thing happened when the engineers turned up to move the saint, the old man who'd come from Baghdad to convert all of Luxor to Islam. They found that when they approached his tomb to lift his body and bring it to his new mosque, that they froze, they couldn't move. It's exactly the same thing that happened when the pallbearers carrying the oracle went past Amenak's house. They froze too. It's exactly the same situation. And as the oracle pointed the finger at Amenak's daughter, so the old saint still lies in his tomb. And the Egyptologists are still wondering what's buried underneath it. When Amenak first became a scribe to work in the royal tombs, the artists were in the doldrums. You get the feeling when you look at their work, because this is what was done about that time, that they were really knocking it out. The life had gone out of the work. And that really is the severest test of Egyptian art. Does the guy look like he's alive? Does the eye look like it might see you? Does the arm look like it might move? Well, I think if you look at this arm very quickly, you'll see that this angle there is so badly drawn, it just doesn't articulate properly. It doesn't look as if it could ever swing. That's because the first process in this work was badly done. These walls, you see, were left white, and then the master draftsman came in and drew the lines that the sculptors would then engrave on the wall. The ancient Egyptians described it, they said, outline draftsman, then graven by chisels, and then coloured. And that's what you've got here. But look, the outline draftsman is really not too worried about the king as a living man. He's just earning his bread, shuffling quickly round the face, miserable little lips that you can hardly see, a snake that's wobbling around on a little thin stick and isn't really alive, an ugly, clunking wig. All this contrives to turn it into a rubber stamp for us, I think. Amenak himself was a painter, and he designed and painted coffins all his life, even after he became scribe. And you can see his impact in the tombs in the 20 years he worked here. In fact, together with his sons, one of whom became the master colour artist, he really oversaw a renaissance in the royal tombs, so that this poor and miserable and lifeless figure blossomed into the wonderful paintings of the later kings. This is probably the only tomb in the Valley of the Kings where you can actually see the master draftsman working on a wall. It's my favourite tomb in the valley, actually. It's probably one of the greatest tombs of Egyptian art, and it's still a bit secret. Not many people know about this tomb or its wonderful drawings. It's the tomb of this man, a bit bashed up here, Prince Montu Herkopeshev, a man who was in charge of the royal chariotry. But it's the artists that are more interesting than the prince here, really. Let's just look at one line. So that's how you really get to see the quality of these painters. Look at this arm here. It runs down, runs along. And then in another colour it starts up there again. Now the artist, before he made that line, because that line takes a second and a half, has thought that this wonderful costume that the prince is wearing is just going to pull slightly on the king's arm, so the skin is moved down slightly. That's really thinking about it. Before you make the move, you think, I want this quality and I want that quality, and you have the skill in your arm to be able to do it in one single stroke. That's amazing. Actually, it's not just a quality of thought and action, because these guys actually had to make their own paints and brushes. There weren't no tubes about in those days. So all these lovely colours here were ground up on pallets, probably several days before they actually came to work in the tomb. And they did this old test, and it still works for paint today, you know. You get a little dab of the paint and you put it between two fingernails and you rub your fingernails together and you feel the grit there. It's not ground enough and you have to grind it for another 4 or 5 hours. When it is ground finely enough and you've left it, then you have to let it stand in the water for a couple of days, because if you don't, when you start drawing these vast long lines here, the little brushes that you use just filter the water from the pigment and you're left with a line of water. So this is not just incredible skill you're looking at, it's also great sophistication and knowledge of your craft. And what an amazing sophistication it is too. These lines run for feet after feet after feet in one stroke. That means that the man actually has control in his arm and his arm muscles, almost like a dancer. And that's what this brush is doing really, is just sort of dancing through the air. Look at this line down the front of the face here. Very quick, very sharp. He knows exactly where he's going and he's got the control from the end of his brush to his arm, like a samurai warrior, you know. I mean, you can just do it. That's really amazing brushwork. And he's thinking all the time. See, these wigs are made of wool. So to get a nice edge to describe their texture, the artist has mixed a bit more water with his paint. He's run it loosely down the edge. And that really has all the textures on the person that described. The sharp gold necklace, the little tassel that wrinkles on it, that holds it, the tassels of the robe. It's all carefully described, carefully worked out with great thought. So, that's the attention this lucky prince got by his artists. Here you can see him in a succession of scenes. He's worshipping gods, the prince worshipping one god after another down the wall. And you know, in the end, the most amazing thing about this tomb is that you can date it so accurately, that this prince is stuck like a fly in amber. Because these scenes have been going on for thousands of years. They're timeless. But this prince, with all his nice new clothes, and his great wigs and his special jewellery, he comes from 1140 BC, exactly. By Montu Herkopeshev's time, some 20 kings have been entombed in the Royal Valley. It must have been the greatest treasure chest of the ancient world, the Fort Knox of its day. Imagine the incredible wealth, gold and precious stones, all quarried from the mountains of Egypt, reburied in these cliffs. Gold, the very skin of the gods. And there were plenty of Thebans and foreigners brave enough to try to rob the dead kings, and not to collect their treasure either, but to smash it up and smelt it down. Ranged against the thieves was a police force. Before the modern road was cut, the entrance to the Royal Valley looked like this. A small stairway leading to a narrow cleft in a rock face. And around the closed valley, a ring of little watchtowers looked down upon the royal tombs. The valley was so quiet that any sound, a footfall, a chisel's blow, would rise like the whisperings in a cathedral dome. The royal tombs stood open to view, shut off from the world only by thin cedar doors. But in fact, much more guarded these ancient kings than these snakes, spitting their magic venom at ancient thieves. For the police regularly inspected the door seals and would have quickly detected a break-in.
So the robbers had to find other ways into the royal tombs. They either made their own tunnels or came in through other doors, through old tombs, long since empty. It was in the very last chamber of the old tomb that the robbers found what they had come for. It was this, a pile of chippings. And at the back of the pile of chippings, some plaster and some stone rudely stuffed into a hole. And this hole, they knew, led down into a royal tomb beneath them. That's where they broke through. Then the men all tumbled down their rope, jumped onto the floor of the royal tomb. And then, of course, it was just a short scramble through here, down to the doors of the royal burial chamber. All that stood between them and the king laying in his burial chamber was a thin cedarwood door which stood here. with small seals, which they broke, threw the door open, and the probably frightened men by now tumbled down these steps into the royal burial chamber. In the centre stood the king, and around him, all the goods of his court. I suppose they quickly stripped those, but the real nut, the real pearl of the whole piece was the mummy of the king himself laying inside his sarcophagus. So they pushed the lid off, and it smashed as it hit the floor, and I'm standing on the bits. They took the royal body out, tore into the mummy bandages, stripped all the jewellery from him, ripped off the royal heart scarab, took the bracelets from his wrists and all the gold leaves that were down his body, threw that to one side, discarded, took his coffins, which were still covered in gold, and took them from the tomb to spoil at their leisure.
Thieving was now widespread throughout the ancient cemeteries of Egypt. Most of the gangs included a boatman who would ferry the thieves away from the plundered graves, sometimes landing them upon an island where they would set fire to their loot and distribute the melted drops of gold amongst themselves. Fortunately, old Scribe Amennac had not lived to see the plunder of the royal tombs, but his son, Scribe Harshiri, had, and he was very worried. For some of the robbers were tomb makers, members of his own family who lived in the village. And although Thebes was a large city, it was a tight-knit community. Gossip spread through it like wildfire. It was very difficult to keep secrets. In an effort to forestall the arrest of the villagers, Harshiri hit upon a cunning scheme. He would pass off the villagers' crime upon other gangs of tomb robbers. So he made an official report to the mayor of Thebes, telling that the royal tombs had been robbed, forcing him to investigate. A grand committee was convened and crossed the river, travelling all around the myriad royal cemeteries, examining the seals upon the tombs' doors in a 2-day inspection. The tomb makers held their breath. Then the news spread. Through the temples and into the village, they were in the clear. They must have sighed with relief. But then it was that they made their fatal mistake. Not knowing Scribe Harshiri's plan, they all piled into ferry boats and crossed the river to confront the mayor, the man who they thought had been their accuser, in a great victory celebration.
So the villagers poured down here to the temple of Karnak, down this very path, in a great happy mob. Actually, it's really a political expression because they were celebrating the uncomfortable defeat of their accuser, the mayor. They were out to find his house now for a celebration in front of it. Well, the mayor's house has long gone to dust, but certainly was in a few feet of where I'm walking at the moment. What we do have, and perhaps there's even more remarkable, is the record of the exact conversation that passed between him and the angry villagers. Well, they got to the house, and there was one hell of a row. The mayor came to the door and met them and said, "You have rejoiced at me over the very door of my house. What do you mean by it? I'm the prince who reports to the king. But by now the villagers were in full flight, and they said, all the kings, together with their royal wives and their royal mothers and the royal children who rest in the great and noble necropolis, that's the Valley of the Kings, are protected and insured forever and ever. And now the mayor was very angry, because he knew they had been robbing the tombs, and he said then, your deeds belie your words. And at that moment, really, they'd sealed their own fate, because the mayor was going to get them. The first thing he did was to isolate the village. Despite all Scribe Hashiri's frantic efforts, the donkey trains that brought their food was stopped, and the villagers, dependent upon the state for their food, slowly began to starve. A beady eye was fixed on the villagers, and their movements were restricted. The thieves' loot, still in the village houses, could not now be moved or hidden. And then disaster struck. They had a house-to-house search of the village, and they found a lot of gold and silver. And as usual, they didn't actually arrest the bosses, of course, but the deputy foreman and 3 members of each gang. And then they brought them and their loot here, across the river. They imprisoned them in a temple. And that is what I'm looking for. Yeah, that's what we've come to see. Here's the king. Here's his name. Here's his hands. And here, a bit bashed up, is a goddess. In her hat, she wears a feather. Now, this feather is a feather that when you die and are called up for judgment, goes on one half of a pair of scales, just like the scales on the Old Bailey, right? And on the other side goes your heart. And if the feather weighs more than your heart, the crocodile eats you up. And that, of course, is why the men came here, because this is her temple. It's the temple of justice, the temple of Mart. And this is where they imprisoned the 8 villagers. Can you imagine? Poor old Scribe Hashiri came across the river and sat probably on this very stone and looked through the grill. There was a door there, you see, and he looked through the grill. And he thinks, despite all his efforts, they've got them. They've got a lot of members of his family, really. They've got his younger brother and his 3 sons, got an uncle and his 3 sons. And the scribe's helpless, he can do nothing. And that evening he goes away. And then for 24 days, those guys are questioned, and they are questioned, and lists are made, and lists, and their arms are twisted, because this is not a court of law, really. They're not actually deciding whether these guys are guilty or innocent. What they're doing is trying to get the loot back. So that's why they're making these lists all the time. And really, in the end, the terrible agony they're going through, because it is agony, it's pretty bad torture, the end only comes when they've got that money back.
Well, what did you do in 1107 BC when you won the pools? Because that's about what these guys had done. They'd ripped off a jackpot, really. When you think that the foreman had made about 50 years' salary and the other robbers with him had made about 25 years, that's a lot of money together. So the lists that they made, the confessions, are absolutely fascinating. Like a cross-section of Theban life, really. So what did they do with all their loot? Well, they came from a poor village, so with some of it they bought food. But after all, food was still relatively inexpensive. So there were lots of other things they could get. They went out and bought themselves new linen clothes, lovely sandals. They bought good strong beer, meat, cooking oil, all sorts of wonderful things. And from all the women that are on the records, without apparently performing any function, you can imagine a good deal of wine, women and song went on as well. But those days were over now. The 8 men were taken back across the river, but they never went back to their village. Probably, in the end, they were tied to wooden stakes in the desert and simply left to die. And even after this, the villagers were not let off the hook. The vizier saw to it that they had no rations for another 3 weeks, and they starved. Then one day he turned up again in Thebes and brought the whole village here to the Valley of the Queens. He was going to teach them a lesson at first hand. Brought them to this tomb here, the very tomb that the 8 men robbed. There's its door. Of course, the tomb door looked nice and shut. It's nice white ceilings down the front, absolutely untouched, unrobbed, it so seemed. Because, of course, if you remember, the 8 men had got in the back of the tomb to rob it. So the vizier had the door took down. And to nobody's surprise, of course, the inside was smashed to fragments. The sarcophagus was in pieces, the coffins were smashed up and everything. The villagers must have looked very shamefaced indeed. And the vizier turned on them and said, "Don't do that again." And he let them have their rations because they've been starving now for a long time. But the villagers' humiliation did not stop there. Although the vizier had restored their rations, the donkey trains did not come to the village bringing their food. And still starving, the villagers walked down from their village, past the great state temples, and across the green fields to the vizier's state barge that was moored at the riverbank. And there they pleaded with him. And then, and only then, he finally relented and gave them bread from his own food stores and ordered them back to work immediately. And in the paintings the village artists made at this time in the king's tomb, something of the nightmare of those months remains. The royal underworld seems haunted by spectres of the villagers' own sufferings. The river and the sun, the twin gifts of the gods that supported the civilization of ancient Egypt. From the distant age of the pyramid builders until the present time, the great river has served as the nation's highway. In ancient times, it was also the main artery of the state, carrying both pharaohs' gilded bark and the state barges that took the royal grain to our village. The village of the craftsmen who made the tombs of the kings. Just imagine that you're in this same place, the ancient town of Esna, just south of Thebes in Upper Egypt, 3,000 years ago. Or to be more exact, imagine you're here on the 8th of September 1085 BC, 2,000 years before the Battle of Hastings. You're in a similar boat, made of wood perhaps, not iron, with a different rigging, with a similar sized crew, and down in the hold, scribbling away at his notes, an ancient scribe, Scribe Jutmos, the chief man of our village, the village of the people that made the royal tombs. He's come to Esna to gather wheat. He's a lucky man in a way, and head of the village now, because a few years earlier the village had been close to starvation. Now the scribes were themselves going out into the countryside to get their own food, to gather their own wheat, and come to Esna to the temple granary to exact the royal taxes. And he'd come at a wonderful time of year, on the high Nile flood, when the river runs straight out to the desert. The whole thing glistened like silver, a wonderful trip. And when he went back with enough wheat to keep him for 2 months, going high on the wind, happy to feed his village again. Especially happy indeed, for a few years earlier, this green land, the breadbasket of Thebes, and some of the world's most fertile fields had withered and died.
For a while, the farmers had managed to feed the city from stocks they had gathered in during more plentiful harvests. But slowly, inexorably, famine came to the valley. It was as if the desert had come down to the river's edge, and they called it the Year of the Hyena.
The man in charge of this terrible time was him, the high priest. He ruled Thebes. He ruled all the thousands of temple bureaucrats and everybody. In fact, he was a very important man. On this relief, for example, he appears exactly the same height as the king. It's quite subtle, because the king has been put on a little plinth, but if you actually measure the figures up, they're the same height. So the high priest has become a really big deal. But still, being a priest, he didn't have an army. And so when the starvation hit the area, in the Year of the Hyenas, when there was really terrifying times at Thebes, he had no way of controlling the riots that took place. And so somebody was brought in from Nubia. The viceroy of Nubia came with his black troops up the Nile and took control of Thebes, and liked it so much he stayed. Now, how do you think we know all this?
Well, right through the Theban temples runs a fragile thread of history.
A busted hieroglyphic text on a temple wall. Of course, the temples are covered in these, and it really tells you how careful you have to be when you come to places like this. You don't run into them or kick them or stand on them or something. Because these have got hundreds of years of history in them, these things. This one, for example, only exists in half. See, these are the lines of the hieroglyphs here, and originally there was a block on top above. We can get more than you might think out of this. These tiny little marks and things, and some of them are made by tourist boots. But just look at this. If I put this mirror here, see those signs jumping? Now, perhaps that's where a tourist has gone and kicked the wall or something like that. But if you really look closely, sometimes you can see the ancient chisel marks, and we know what sort of chisel marks we're talking about. So when you get to a sign right up here on the edge, look at that line jump up into shape there. And that can tell you the difference between the guy coming up from Nubia or not coming up from Nubia. It can be that important. That's why this sort of work is so interesting. Might not look much, but it's really fascinating. It's better than digging holes in the ground. Anyway, these columns, they ran up here, of course, onto another block. We don't have the other block now. But very fortunately, the guy who worked on this particular wall, the man who first translated it, realised that all this was the copy of an inscription on the base of a statue, and so he was able to restore these bits we didn't have. But of course there are 4 unique lines in this text, and they're the ones we're interested in, and they're over here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 8 months from the Year of the Hyena. You know, it's the only mention of this in any temple in Egypt. See, in this inscription, this way, that's just prayers to Ammon. But in that direction, it's actually the speech of a man from 3,000 years ago. It's his voice speaking to us on a lump of history.
And it tells us of the state's collapse, of a time of terrible anarchy.
Poor old Egyptians. First of all, their high priest is suppressed. Then the Nubian viceroy, who turned up with his troops to put things right, started to settle here. It was 10 years of chaos. It must have been a very hard life. But the king settled it. He sent his general here to take control. And this is his name. Written here. Harry Hall. Don't forget it. They're coming back to him. Because he's a man, really, who left the biggest mystery of the village, I think you might say. He was also powerful enough to get his name in a royal cartouche. Powerful enough, too, to instigate a series of royal commissions to look at all the terrifying things that happened in the Year of the Hyena. Scribe Jutmos was appointed on the commission that was to investigate the looting of the temples in the Year of the Hyenas. was a terrible time. It was a time when a woman with a small garden of date palms could sell little pressed blocks of dates for silver. It was a time when thieves called their loot bread. That's not in the modern hip sense of the word, but in a very real sense, because they were stealing for bread. And in the temple itself, Thutmose found even more terrible things had happened. When Thutmose and the commissioners investigated what had happened in the temple, the situation looked even worse. See, these doorways were once partly plated in gold. See these holes along the bottom here probably held the wedges that helped the gold lay flat on the walls all round here. In the centre, of course, would have been two vast cedar doors. The wood alone was worth a fortune. It had come all the way from Lebanon, after all. And the cedar was covered, in this case, with copper and bronze in great quantity. We know that because Thutmose's commission had made a very accurate record of exactly what happened here. And what happened was this. The junior employees in the temple started slowly, presumably as they started to starve, slowly to nibble away at the copper, and nobody noticed, so they took some more. And nobody noticed, and they took some more. Then one day their boss came in and noticed that all the copper was being stripped off the doors. And whilst they waited in trepidation, he asked for his cut of the loot, which they gave him, and that, of course, was the end. Because behind these doors that the priest had stripped and sawn into blanks lay the shrines of the gods, and so the priests move in on them. These shrines, you see, were cedar boxes covered with a very heavy gold, sort of much heavier than a gold leaf, really, quite heavy stuff. And this was what they pulled off, stripped away, and then the carpenters came in and sawed the planks up. It's the end of Egypt. Although they carried on in this church for 1,000 years, it was really a recreation of the original. The original flower was lost in the year of the hyena. Poor scribe Thutmose. Instead of making new monuments, he now spent his time investigating and plundering the works of his forefathers. It was a time of disillusion and insecurity, and a hard age for his villagers. Scribe Thutmose left us no great monuments of his own, but he scribbled all over the cliffs here at Thebes. This is one of the more extraordinary, as he's put the actual date he came here and scratched into the rock. October the 5th, 1079 BC. That's the date he works out now, of course. In those days, he pre-expressed it year 18, such and such a time. And there's his name, Scribe Thutmose. And with it, he's written 4 generations of his family, right back to great-grandfather Amennacht. Of course, things were very different in Amennacht's day. He was a big man who made big tombs in a rich state. Scribe Thutmose was overseeing the dissolution of all that. He was more interested in his family, little things, memorialising the great relatives that it had in the past. Our scribe had come to this lonely valley to check on that ancient royal tomb behind me, and he was particularly interested in it because the generals of his own time didn't want to be buried in the public tombs in the Valley of the Kings, but were looking once again at these little remote valleys to put their own secret tombs inside. With these new rulers and their new style of tomb would come a different life for the old village. And perhaps this was none too soon. By this time, Thutmose's ancestors had been burying the village dead for 500 years in this crumbling hillside. Scribe Thutmose couldn't build himself a tomb like this. There was simply no room left above ground. And underneath, the hillside was like a Swiss cheese, brittle with holes. The cemetery was simply full up. Things were just as bad in the village. the old houses were getting really decrepit. In this one, for example, the roof collapsed during a brief rainstorm, and all the papyrus rolls that were stored in here, it was the village library, were soaked. And if you go to the BM, the British Museum, or the Louvre, and you see the rolls of papyrus today, you can see on their backs the sand where the scribes had laid them out here on the ground to dry. The walls, as you can see, are all buckling. 25 coats of paint now covered them. So it was really time to move. There are other reasons too. General Herihor, who ruled Thebes, really needed an independent body of intelligent, literate Thebans to help him run the place, because he didn't really want to get involved with the old power blocks, the priests and the army. They were really rather discredited in the era of the hyenas. The villagers, therefore, were his perfect choice. Family by family, they moved down to the enclosure of the fortress temple that held the offices of the administration. So the village moved to this part of the temple enclosure at Medinet Habu. The scribe Jutmo has built himself a magnificent house here. These are the ruins of it I'm walking through at the moment. Much, much bigger than anything he'd ever had at the village, and quite in keeping with his status as one of the most important men in Upper Egypt. Actually, he was away most of the time, and it was his son, Buta Amun, who actually put up these columns. So it was Buta Amun who had himself carved on the columns of his house at Medinet Habu. And he really is our last character in all of village history. He was a kind man, had a big family. He loved his mother and father, and he had great reverence for the traditions of Thebes, for the old kings and temples. He lived in a difficult time. It was a time when, as the generals had given the villagers land so they would be self-sufficient, they were all learning to be farmers. In a sense, it was Squire Buta Amun now. And you have this unlikely picture of these tomb makers who haven't touched a farm implement for 500 years, rushing around asking farmers how to plant trees and things. But it was quite a hard life. And poor Buta Amun's wife died in the process. And he was very fond of her. He wrote her this really very touching letter. "Good to me are my mother and father. They have come, but you, my wife, have been taken away from me. You who brought the cattle home. You who attended to our fields. You who were loaded with all kinds of heavy loads when there was no resting place to put them down. O Achtoi, my wife, you gracious one as woman." The death of his wife seems to have made the young Buta Amun wise beyond his years. And that perhaps was just as well, for the task that now confronted him was grim. With Scribe Jutmos away from Thebes, the generals asked his son, Buta Amun, to open the tombs in the Valley of the Kings again. Buta Amun would have slithered down this same corridor on the way to inspect the tomb, then come to a sudden halt here, right on the edge of a 40-foot pit, designed, amongst other things, to stop thieves. Then he could have looked over at the doorway on the other side, and there he would have seen the robber's hole, the great rope hanging down from it like a tail. Depressed, I expect, he threw his own rope down here and crossed to the other side, where he probably used the robber's rope to climb up. And look, still, down there, the same rope that they all used. By the time that Buta Amun had got this far into the royal tomb, he must have realised that another king's burial had been robbed. And once again, as he entered the royal burial chamber, he found the lid of the sarcophagus pushed to one side, and then realised with that awful sinking feeling, I expect, that another king had been robbed and the jewellery torn off his body. Well, what would you have done?
You see, Tutankhamun hadn't just found a king that had all his jewellery taken off him. The corpse had been hacked about, all the bandages had been split open. And the tomb, well, that had been rendered into fragments. It was as if somebody like Cromwell perhaps had gone into the abbey and torn everything to pieces, with every little item of any value smashed to fragments. That was the depressing scene that Tutankhamun had to deal with. The statues of the gods that stood round the king in their shrines, these had been taken out, the arms and legs had been ripped off, thrown against the wall. Everything was stripped, everything was bare, everything rendered into useless fragments. These, for example, were simple jars that held grain, and even these the thieves went round and smashed them to see if there was anything hidden amongst the grain.
Well, what would you have done to save the ancient kings? For 3,000 years after Tutankhamun's death, no one knew the answer. Then, just over 100 years ago, the truth came to light as a modern villager, Ahmed Abdur Rasul, walked down this mountain track. Today, the frightening path is called Agatha Christie's path, after an episode in one of her stories when a criminal uses it as a shortcut to build up a false alibi. But as young Ahmed climbed that day, he had solved another mystery. For across the valley, he'd spotted a small hole, just there in the cleft of sunlight. It was a recent cave-in, and, the shrewd Ahmed realised, the entrance to an ancient tomb. Ahmed and his brothers had opened one of the most remarkable archaeological discoveries of all time. One of the secret vaults where Tutankhamun's kings had finally been laid to rest. A dozen pharaohs in a borrowed tomb. The brothers treated their treasure trove with great care, visiting it but 3 times in 10 years, and then taking only the richest and most precious of its treasures to sell to private collectors. But with all their care, their secret was out, and a cat and mouse game developed.
The whole problem of which museum should house these royal mummies became a contest between the Abd Rasul brothers and the professional Egyptologists.
The Egyptologists, of course, were in it for a number of reasons. There were certain political advantages from such a great discovery, and there was also professional advantages in their career. But perhaps most important was the simple fact that pure science demanded they should find the tomb intact and not as handed out bit by the Abd Rasul brothers. The Abd Rasul brothers, on the other hand, well, their demands were a little less esoteric. After all, the Turks had been occupying Egypt for a long time and had reduced this part of the country to extreme starvation. Finding a tomb like this was really finding the crock of gold, and the family held on to their discovery with a tremendous tenacity. The authorities came into this house here and dug up the floor, found nothing. They threw one of the brothers in prison. Another they tortured to such an extent he could never walk properly again. But in the end, the Abd Rasuls managed to bargain with the authorities, by which they did quite well. And after about a year of this dickering and havering backwards and forwards, a terrible war of nerves, one of the 3 brothers led the Europeans to the ancient kings.
رمسيس الثاني.
Times were very hard, and even with their soldiers to guard them, the Egyptologists were frightened when they came to take the ancient kings. In a great procession, like that Thebes had seen many times over the millennia, the ancient kings, all wrapped in ship sails for their journey to Cairo,
were carried back down from the desert and into Thebes again, past the fortress temple where Tutankhamun had lived, through the ruined monuments of the ancient kings. And there, it is said, a strange thing happened. For as the soldiers and the Egyptologists carried off their trophies, all the villagers came to watch this strange progress, and a great wail, like that heard at the ancient funerals, echoed again through the Theban fields, through the empty temples, and into the desert cemeteries beyond. Their kings were leaving them forever. Whilst Tutankhamun collected ancient kings, his father, Scribe Jutmo, sailed south on a mission for the generals that ruled Thebes. His boat landed at Elephantine, the town on the southern border of Egypt, its name taken from the strange-shaped granite rocks that seemed, to the ancients, to be carved into stony elephants. And there he wrote home to his village, the start of a remarkable correspondence between father and son that is one of our most vivid slices of ancient life. Jutmo started by describing his journey south.
I've reached the general, he said. Indeed, I found that he sent a boat to meet me. I met him at the town of Elephantine, and there he gave me bread and beer. And he said to me, "May the war god favour you. We are going up to Nubia to meet the rebels at the place where they are."
His letter arrived safely in Tutankhamun's house. Can you imagine, here in the family home at Thebes, the scribe sitting on his chair here, all the family all around him as they sat and tried to write a letter to bolster up the old man's spirits? "Do not go forth to see the fighting," they said. "You have not been taken there as a prisoner or press-ganged. You have been taken south in order that advice may be sought of you. Stay in the bottom of the boat. Protect yourself against the arrows and spears. You are not to abandon us all, for you know that you are the father of us all. And as soon as my letter reaches you, please write me a letter in your handwriting that I may know you are still alive."
The son must have been greatly reassured by his father's next letter, because it contained all that marvellous individual mix of compassion and irritableness that he must have known so well by this time. Now, by the way, old man was deep in Nubia. He was praying to strange gods. He says at the top of his letter, "I tell every day Satis and Anukis to cause you to live and to be in health, not the old gods of Thebes." Then goes on to give his son an order, rather a sad order. "The general has said to me, cause the men to work on the spears. You're to give the coppersmiths the village chisels and have them made into spears." In other words, the tools which the villagers traditionally used in the royal tombs were now to be used for armaments. And in many ways, that's the end of the village life. And then, a pure blast of his old dad. "Why do you not write to me and tell me what is in your heart," he says. "Do not cease writing to me."
Tutankhamun must have smiled a bit when he got his father's impatient letter. But he replied in good enough heart, "Now the children are all right. Your wife and daughter are all right. No harm has come to them. All your people are alive, prospering and healthy." Then he went on to discuss some business, some spears that got lost that he'd sent to his father with the troops, and some bandages too. Indeed, the campaign had started so quickly that even the general had left his clothes behind when he got on the boat. And at the end of the letter, he made a usual prayer. Now, he said, I am praying to the Ammon of our old village. I'm standing in his open court, daily, unweakening, praying that soon we may fill our embrace with you again.
The scribe's last letters from Nubia were written in a deserted fort next to a closed gold mine, a long way from anywhere. I tell the Horus of Kuban, he said, this strange, neglected place, to bring me back alive from Yar. Now, Yar's a strange name. If you look at Egyptian letters, you'll find it can be anywhere. It can be in Egypt, Syria, Nubia, just about anywhere. One Egyptologist has suggested the true meaning, I think, and that is hellhole, a really awful place. He goes on, the scribe goes on, I'm abandoned in this far-off land and cannot fill my embrace with you. When your letter reached me, my heart became alive, my eyes opened and I raised my head, whereas I had been ill. But now I'm all right again. And then he goes on with the normal thoughts of village business. Give your attention to the donkeys and the men who are in the fields, and pray to Ammon to bring me back alive.
Sadly, the old scribe didn't live long after he wrote that letter. We don't know whether he returned to Thebes or not. Certainly he died about that time and was buried in the family vault. At the desert village, the sand was now slowly covering the houses, and the rooms where the tomb makers and their families had sat and laughed together in the evening light were being sealed in to be carefully excavated 3,000 years later. No longer would the villagers climb up from their houses to the cemetery and leave offerings for their ancestors. No more would the villagers light the little candles in a ghostly Halloween to guide the souls of their ancient dead back from their pilgrimage to the city of Osiris. Even the records of Buta Ammon and his family suddenly stop. And then, as the villagers completely disappear, we suddenly realise how fragile has been this link with these ancient lives. By happy chance, however, Buta Ammon's own coffin has been preserved, the final product of this village of master painters who made some of Egypt's finest monuments and can proudly stand beside the best draftsmen of any age. The scribe himself painted some of this. Images of the royal tombs now decorating the coffins of a humble scribe. And here, Buta Ammon's smile holds in it, perhaps, a hint of a final extraordinary mystery.
Remember Herihor and his cartouche? The man who left us with a mystery? Because the villagers buried him, but we've never found his tomb. Come to that, the village buried two of his successors, and we haven't found their tombs either.
And we know that they are still in their tombs, and still probably unplundered, surrounded by all the treasures of their burial. For not one piece of Herihor's tomb has ever been found, unlike other monarchs who are now in museums, though their tombs are still unknown. Now in Herihor's day, the Valley of the Kings lay robbed and opened. No king would have ever been buried there. We may assume then that the general rests in other cliffs, buried far away from the old cemeteries by Buta Ammon and his villagers. A congregation of clues has led me into these distant valleys. These ancient paths, for one, beautifully made and well designed, range mile after mile into the desert hills, often rising up through sheer cliffs by means of hidden staircases that are cut into the clefts in the rock face. Five and even 10 miles from food and water, the paths run on and on, leading sometimes to ancient settlements, shelters for people in a hard environment usually inhabited only by scorpions, snakes and crows. Judging by the pottery that still lies all around them, the settlement dates to the age of our villagers. What then was happening here? Well, another man was also puzzled by these strange signs of ancient life, and he spent month after month walking through these hills.
There he is, Howard Carter, 1916, 6 years before he discovered the tomb of Tutankhamun. If you want to ever see anything interesting in these wadis, look for that name, because the chances are Howard Carter got there before you. He's the first man ever to look in these desolate, distant places when all the other archaeologists were working down in the big temples. He was in these lonely desert valleys looking for royal tombs. And he really hit a jackpot, because on this wall is a really massive inscription. You can't see it, it's rather difficult to see, but because it's scratched very faintly, but it's here in great long lines of text. And what it tells us is that in a certain day, in January 1057 BC, the scribe Tutankhamun, our old friend, came out here to look in the mountains, the next sign, where there were coffins left. Somebody reported that there were coffins laying around out here in the mountains. Tutankhamun came up here with a group of men for 5 or 6 days. Now, what on earth was a royal scribe, such a senior man, doing in such a desolate place?
Well, the answer, as Howard Carter discovered, lies just over this ridge.
That tomb is the reason why Carter was scouring these wadis. It's the tomb of Queen Hatshepsut, and he's credited as being the discoverer of it, or Lord Carnarvon is, who wasn't even in Egypt at the time. But let me tell you the whole story, because it's one really on which the sun will never set, a perfect empire yarn. Carter was sitting in his house one night, and his servant came and told him that 8 men were robbing a tomb high in the mountains. So Carter set out with his own rope, and by midnight, he was on the top of that cliff over there, looking down the side. He couldn't see anything, it was pitch black, but he could hear voices murmuring away down, and he saw a rope hanging down by the side of the tomb. So he cut the rope, put up his own, and then climbed down it into the darkness, into the night. What an extraordinary thing to do, what extraordinary confidence those people had. So, he climbed down into the tomb, and then, as he puts it, there was an awkward moment. You can imagine it, can't you? The Englishman standing there in his jodhpurs, and 8 amazed local people wondering what the hell was going to happen next. So a few sentences passed between them, and as Carter said, they saw reason and scrambled up his rope and ran off into the dark. And Carter it was then who was left as king of the tomb.
So, let's recap. What led us into this distant valley was these old paths. The strange settlement, the rock inscription of Scribe Tutankhamun himself, and then at the valley's ending, a royal tomb. In the next valley, the same pattern repeats itself. Tutankhamun was there. Howard Carter excavated these deep pits. And he also found this tomb where a princess had been buried, but sadly, it had been ruined long before Carter's day. And in the next valley, too, the pattern is again to be found. Here, hidden deep in this cleft, was a tomb cut for 3 princesses,
and this has provided much of the splendid ancient gold in New York's Metropolitan Museum. This entire network of valleys is filled with the same clues, and these repeat themselves in the same pattern, one after another. Clearly, the tomb makers laboured long and hard in this distant place for hundreds of years, right up to the time of King Herihor. And that's why I believe that the search for the lost tombs should be continued in these valleys. Let me show you what I look for. Well, I'm especially interested in these deep cracks, for example, that run right down into the valley floor. One of the real giveaways for finding one of these tombs is this great crack, because a lot of the ancient tomb makers used these cracks as one wall of the shaft which they would dig down into the ground. Then, of course, when they dug the tomb, they would put some plaster over the top of it. And these cracks, which were made by being waterfalls, would fill up again with that sort of debris there and cover the tomb completely, so it would absolutely vanish. But the most important clue, the one that really tells you this is a tomb, is on this wall over here. Because this piece of wall here has been chiselled away by a man using a flint axe. Look, it's quite obvious when you come to see it. First of all, along the edge here, you can see the bashes that the flint's made. See? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, boom, boom, boom. And you know that's not natural because you can see the grain in this rock. Look, here on this edge where he's really bashed it away, he's chipped off lumps going that way. So this rock is actually, the grain in this rock is like a sandwich, and this guy's been cutting the end off. It could never naturally go like that sort of surface. In 100,000 years it couldn't go like that. So all this here has been smoothed off naturally by man. And then here, of course, well, that little thing's a footmark, a foothold for the man to go down into the tomb. So, having proved that this is man-made, that we've got a nice big hole beneath us, this is the tomb for going into. And I must say, whenever I do go into these tombs, I always leave my hat at the top so people know where I am. Oh, blimey, I once got stuck in a tomb like this. Blooming hours I was getting out. Somebody had to come and lift me off in the end. It was terrible. Dear, oh dear. Oh dear. Full up. Oh my God. What's that? Well, still full up. Nobody's been down there in a long time. And that, I think, is the bottom of a large water jar. Perhaps from the burial, perhaps from the people who made the tomb. Certainly it's from the same time as the tomb, about 1500 BC. But that's some 500 years too early for Herihor, so I have concentrated my search in an even more remote valley. Let me show you why. Here's our man again, Howard Carter, 1916. It's a very busy year. He must have been rushing about all over the place. Why was he excited enough to write his name here? Well, to start with, somebody else has written their name here, a few years before him. Tutankhamun, our Royal Scribe, was here 1,000 years BC. He buried kings. But the most important clue on this rock, and even nearer to Howard Carter's own name, is the name of the priest-king Herihor. Remember him? The man who built the temple in Karnak? Well, his tomb's never been found. But there is a papyrus in Vienna which actually talks about building it. Archaeologists assume it's somewhere around here. I think Carter had a pretty good idea where it was. Which is why, of course, he dug so many holes here, looking for a buried tomb, spurred on, no doubt, by these ration lists of ancient workmen and inscriptions that tell us of royal tombs. But the biggest clue of all in this desolate place is this nondescript heap of rubble. This hillside might just look like a crummy heap of rock, but it's actually far more than that. You see, these sort of stones, these type of chippings, really don't occur naturally. They're made by man banging at a rock. Hopefully, of course, making a tomb in this case. The extraordinary thing about this hillside too is that we can tell almost how old it is. And that's because of its colour. You see, these beautiful amber rocks around us get this way because of particles of clay that are brought here in the wind. It's ordinary white limestone, just like you get on the South Downs, but it's stained, it's almost like a suntan, this beautiful brown colour. And that's, of course, is what you can see here. Now, that takes 2,000 or 3,000 years to build up. But if we yank out one of these rocks, you can see there, it's pure white underneath. That rock's been there a long time, and it's been cut by man. So, Carter comes to this empty valley full of its inscriptions, and there in the middle is a huge pile of rocks, which from his experience in the Valley of the Kings look just like tomb chippings. What was he to think? Well, for the answer to that, you have to turn to his laundry list. He was a busy man and scribbled away on anything he could find. And on this list, under items that say he's got to pay his houseboy and buy some raspberry jam, we find a list of the things he found in this valley. Now, we found fragments of wood, that is, bits of scaffolding and things like this. He found bits of rope, very handy for moving things. He found charcoal from the men's cooking. The most important thing of all was he found something which he called a boss from a sarcophagus. In fact, he found 4 of them. Now, these sarcophagi bosses, these are rather interesting things. These are left by the people who cut the sarcophagi from the rock, standing out from the main shape of the sarcophagus. They're very useful when you're moving these big heavy things through the landscape, to have something to tie the rope onto, like big knobs. Of course, when you put them in the tomb, you then cut them off so the sides are left nice and smooth. Of course, we never found the sarcophagus, but Carter found 4 bosses in this very valley. So what an immense amount of evidence is here. The pathways leading to the site, the men's houses, the inscriptions that mention a tomb, chippings that come from a tomb. It's fairly obvious, isn't it? Somewhere in this great circle of cliffs lies at least one king, silent in an unplundered tomb. And that is why I come here whenever I can, searching out ancient clues, and perhaps even the tomb itself. Perhaps isolated, here on a sheer cliff. Perhaps, like Carter's, hidden deep in a rocky cleft. It's a long and arduous business. Eventually, the entire valley must be mapped, and every little text, every small piece of evidence, hunted down and carefully evaluated. Evidence like this faint ancient path running diagonally across your screen. A path, incidentally, that leads straight to the bottom of this rocky cleft. Well, it's a good one. Nobody's been around here for a long time. Nobody's dug it. No later things, no pots. This could be quite a good one. Goodness me. Well, this is it. The end of the line. The end of the ancient road, too. I didn't expect to see great gold pots sticking out the ground or a huge shining white door with a Royal Necropolis seal stamped in the middle of it. I tell you why. Because I came up that great scree of rock, and that's come down from the chimney quite recently, in the last few centuries, brought down by the bats that live up there and the water that's washed down through here. So we're actually about 10 feet above any ancient level that's in here. But still, you can sometimes find something to look at around here. Some little mark, some ancient chisel mark perhaps, because you see the ancient masons often smoothed the rock up for several metres above tomb doors. Sometimes they left little dots of red ochre about the place. Well, there's nothing here though. Not a mark. But nonetheless, this is a very good place. This is absolutely virgin site. I mean, there's been no Christian hermit has ever lived here. Howard Carter's not dug the place about. It's absolutely untouched, except by a few bats and the rocks that have come down from above. So it could well be that there's a king just a few feet under me. Extraordinary, isn't it? I tell you, there are about 14 of these in this wadi. One day I want to come back and dig them out. Can you imagine what it would be like if we found a king? Can you see us there? Have all the archaeological arc lights around the door, and slowly you go into the burial of a king. And then suddenly, because you're involved in an archaeological ritual, you're joining on again to the villagers because they had their rituals. Old Tutankhamun, when he put the king in the coffin, he was doing it to an order, and then we'd be taking it out to an order. And the two of us, if you like, or the people of today and the people of the past, which is better, would be joining together over thousands of years in a single tremendous ritual.